Somewhere in the East African twilight, nearly 2 million years ago, a child sits beside a fire. Her people are still learning to shape stone, but already something strange is happening behind their eyes. Their brains are growing faster than their bodies. Their thoughts burn longer than the flames. In that silent gap between predator and shelter, light and dark, something irreversible begins. Not just intelligence, but introspection. The kind of mind that replays a sound until it becomes a word. That remembers a death long after the bones are gone. That wonders quietly if the stars are watching back. It's easy to take for granted. But no other animal on Earth developed a brain so vast, so demanding, so hungry for meaning. Why us? Why such a costly organ? One that steals a fifth of every meal, reshapes our bodies, even endangers birth itself. Tonight we follow the trail of that question, across firelit camps, frozen tundra and forgotten art. The answer begins not in dominance, but in a peculiar vulnerability, and it ends in a mirror. This is Midnight Sapien, calm storytelling for curious minds. If you'd like to follow along, look just below the video. The button says subscribe. You can tap or press it any time, and unsubscribe whenever you like. The little bell icon next to it will notify you when new stories arrive. Subscribing helps this channel survive. Without your support, new videos simply can't be made. If these stories bring you calm, you can tap the super thanks under this video. It truly helps keep these prehistoric journeys alive. I often wonder where this story is being heard. What part of the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, let's know in the comments. It's a quiet reminder that we're all listening together. Oh, and if your eyes get heavy, that's perfectly okay. You'll find chapter timestamps in the description whenever you want to return. Now let us begin with a mirror in the skull. Why do we have such massive brains? Not just big, massive, when measured against the size of our bodies, our birth canals, our caloric needs. By almost every standard in the animal kingdom, the human brain is an anomaly. It weighs just under 3 pounds, yet it consumes over 1/5 of the energy our bodies use every day. And unlike other creatures, whose instincts arrive nearly ready-made, our brain takes years to unfold. We are born unfinished, fragile and dependent. And still, we grew them. Through eons of trial, famine, migration and fear, we carried these bulky, inefficient organs forward. The question presses quietly through the folds of time. Why? The shape of our skull is a clue. Bulbous, rounded like a swollen seed. It cradles not just a brain, but a mystery. If you hold a mirror up to the human face, you'll see symmetry, intention, recognition. But if you could hold a mirror to the mind, what would you find reflected there? Language, memory, grief, the shape of a story. The awareness that you are, and one day you will not be. These are not traits common to survival. They're expensive, slow, and often paralyzing. Yet they are everywhere in us. What must it have taken then for nature, so often frugal, so often brutal, to allow this organ to grow? What pressures could justify such a costly design? Begin, if you will, by stepping back. Among the great apes, our closest cousins, brains are large, but not disproportionate. A gorilla may weigh over 400 pounds, but its brain rarely exceeds 1/3 the size of a human's. Chimpanzees, with whom we share a common ancestor, are clever, social, minds, and inventive. Yet their mental world remains bound to the present moment, to the immediate reward. They have the tools, but not the architecture. They know the now, but not the future. And still, we are cut from the same cloth. The divergence between Homo and Pan is not one of invention, but of expansion. Somewhere, at some point, our lineage began feeding an entirely new kind of fire. But was it always a fire? Or was it first a burden? Because big brains come at a price. First there is the fuel. Neurons burn energy with insatiable hunger. A larger brain means a body that must scavenge, hunt, or invent more efficient ways to extract calories. It means a digestive system that must shrink in favour of a thinking organ that must swell. It means, in the cold math of evolution, a trade. Smaller guts for greater minds. And second, there is the risk. A larger head endangers childbirth. Human infants born with unfinished skulls must be pushed into the world early. long before they can walk, speak, or survive alone. Why risk it? What kind of pressure, what kind of story pushes a species towards such fragility in order to gain? What? What does a larger mind really offer when the cost is so great? Let us look again at the fire, not the fire made of flame, not yet, but the one that smouldered quietly inside the skull. Before tools, before words, before even the idea of tomorrow, something in the early hominin mind flickered and caught. A new kind of attention, perhaps, a lingering thought, a question held in place long enough to shift a decision. Intelligence had existed before, in dolphins and crows, in the clever hands of primates. But here, among these upright walkers on the African plains, the mind itself began to bend toward complexity, toward reflection, toward memory. But memory alone does not build a brain like ours, nor does simple problem-solving. Many animals solve problems, some even plan. But what if the critical ingredient was not survival but curiosity? What happens when curiosity becomes a survival trait? Imagine a forager scanning a new patch of savanna. There are fruits, but some are bitter. There are insects, but some are poisonous. The individuals who linger, who hesitate, who observe before they act, these may live. The ones who remember which branch held sweetness, or who notice a change in animal tracks before the herd moves, these may return fed. Curiosity then becomes more than indulgence. It becomes an edge, and like all edges, it sharpens over time. Across generations, those who wonder may pass on more than just their genes. They pass on the trait of wondering itself. A child who follows ants, who stares at clouds, who mimics sounds in the dark. This child is not distracted. This child is learning to model the world, and as modelling improves, so too does foresight, so too does empathy. But can you pass down wonder? Not directly, not the feeling, but you can pass down the capacity for it. And slowly, over thousands of generations, the brain begins to reshape itself in the image of its questions. Still, we must remember, each expansion of the brain required a sacrifice. The body had to change. The pelvis widened, then narrowed again. Birth became a crisis. Human babies emerged unable to support their heads, requiring years of nurture and constant vigilance. The mother could no longer forage alone. Social bonds had to grow. Fathers, grandmothers, siblings. The entire group became part of the child's survival. And with this shift, a new kind of intelligence took root. Relational, cooperative, emotional. The brain was no longer just a tool for navigation or hunger. It was becoming a mirror for other minds. And mirrors create feedback. To understand another's thoughts is to expand your own, to anticipate emotion, to recognize pain, to guess intention. These are not just social tricks, they are architecture. The neural networks required to model another brain from within your own are among the most complex tasks any organ can perform. So the brain grew, not all at once, not smoothly, but like the slow bend of a river carving a canyon, it deepened. And what did it find in that depth? Not only perception, not only memory. It found the beginning of an inner landscape, a territory that existed nowhere in the world except inside the folds of a single organ, a place where images could be held long after the eyes had closed, where danger could be imagined before it arrived, where the movements of animals, the taste of plants, the whispers of weather could be rehearsed in silence. This inner world, fragile at first, became a refuge and a workshop. The early human mind learned to carry the savannah inside it, to walk its paths even when night fell or storms gathered. And with each generation, the structures that supported this quiet rehearsal grew denser, more intricate. Yet the expansion came with another burden. The brain demanded fuel, and fuel demanded innovation. Unlike other species that balanced their needs with predictable niches, early humans were forced to become generalists. They experimented with roots, tubers, bone marrow, insects, small animals. Every bite of energy mattered, because every firing neuron burned it. Survival was no longer just about strength or swiftness. It was about sustaining an organ that strained the body from within. What happens when a species becomes a servant to its own brain? The cost was extraordinary, and yet the reward kept growing. With each increase in brain volume, new abilities emerged, small at first, like lights appearing one by one on the horizon. Recognition of patterns, prediction of outcomes, imitation of others. Imitation became ritual, ritual became culture, and culture became a memory stored not only in neurons, but in shared behaviour. A group could remember dangers that no single individual had witnessed. Knowledge survived even when bodies did not. But perhaps the most astonishing shift occurred when the mind began to notice itself. A spark of self-awareness, faint at first, like a ripple across still water. A sense of I, a sense that the world was not only perceived, but perceived by someone. This knowing carried both power and weight. To understand the self is to understand vulnerability. To anticipate death is to carry fear. Yet even fear played its part in the brain's expansion, sharpening attention, deepening caution, forcing minds to anticipate the unseen. Through this interplay of curiosity, burden, fear and innovation, the brain swelled again. But swelling alone cannot explain its peculiar shape. Something else was happening beneath the surface, something more subtle. Neural connections were branching like the limbs of an ancient tree, forming networks capable not only of storing information, but of recombining it. Imagination emerged, the ability to merge memory with possibility. What happens when a creature can blend what was with what might be? In that question lies the beginning of invention, and invention, once ignited, is almost impossible to contain. The moment a brain can imagine a tool that does not yet exist, or a shelter not yet built, or a danger not yet seen, it crosses a threshold. It becomes not just a recorder of the world, but a constructor of it. Early humans were no longer merely reacting to the environment. They were anticipating, shaping, redesigning it. They became architects of the unseen, and in that role, the brain found new dimensions to expand into, not simply in mass, but in function. It was not merely becoming bigger, it was becoming layered, recursive, symbolic. But what forces held open the evolutionary door long enough for this transformation to occur? Biologists speak often of pressures, of selection, of adaptation to environment. But sometimes the environment is not a landscape. It is a relationship, a glance, a silence. The subtle dance between a mother and child, the synchrony of breath between lovers, the caution in a stranger's posture. The early human brain, especially in its enlarged frontal lobes, began to process not only objects, but intentions. It could guess what another might do. It could lie. It could comfort. And in this vast and growing realm of social cognition, survival became a matter not of might, but of mind. Yet this realm was also expensive. Each new domain of intelligence required neural real estate. To understand geometry, one must first see shape. To master language, one must store symbols. To maintain social alliances, one must track the shifting web of loyalties, betrayals, favours, and trust. The human brain, especially the neocortex, became an accountant of minds, and as it did, it required ever more energy. And so we cooked. Fire, the literal one now, changed everything. It unlocked calories from food in ways no raw diet could sustain. It allowed meat and starch to be digested quickly, freeing time and energy. It softened roots, boiled parasites away, warmed nights. Fire turned the world into a more usable version of itself, and with that gift, the brain could afford to grow. Cooking didn't just change our diets. It changed our destiny. And yet, energy alone does not explain why the brain continued to expand beyond the immediate needs of foraging or fleeing. Elephants, after all, are intelligent, but did not walk this path. Whales, too, have large brains, and still they did not split stones or bury their dead. So what was it truly that pulled humanity toward ever greater consciousness? Could it be that once a mind begins to question, it cannot easily stop? That once a brain achieves a certain threshold of reflection, it starts to hunger for meaning as deeply as it hungers for food? That curiosity itself, once unleashed, becomes the most relentless evolutionary pressure of all? And if that's true, what kind of creature do you become when the very act of wondering is what keeps you alive? You become a builder of questions. a seeker of patterns, a mind entangled not only in survival but in story. The human brain, swollen with centuries of silent selection, had begun to do something no organ before it ever had. It generated narratives, not just chains of events but cause and consequence, memory and prophecy, self and other. Our ancestors didn't simply see the world, they imagined it, reimagined it, described it, explained it to their children with symbols drawn in ash and ochre. In this way, knowledge began to live outside the body, and with it, so did the mind. This is the hidden inheritance that lives inside the folds of your own brain, that you're capable of holding not only information, but contradiction, that you can imagine what is not present, that you can step into another's sorrow, that you can create an entire future in your thoughts, and grieve it before it even happens. No other creature does this, not like we do. No other species has a mind so vulnerable to fear, so heavy with awareness, and yet so radiant with potential. It is easy to forget that this was not always the plan. Nature did not decree that humans would inherit the earth. Our brains were not destined to expand. We were never the fastest, never the strongest. But perhaps from the beginning, we were the most curious. We looked up at the stars and felt something. We stared into the eyes of the dying and asked why. We listened for meaning in the silence between sounds, and somehow the brain listened back. Over 2 million years, from Homo habilis to Homo sapiens, the organ inside our skull tripled in size. It adapted to climate swings, to migrations, to hunger and fire and grief. It became a mirror of the world and a forge for new worlds. And in the process, it made something no fossil can fully contain, a mind capable of asking, why did this happen? And then asking again, in a new way, with a new metaphor, in a new tongue. Why do humans have such unusually large brains? Because we dared to imagine that things could be different than they were. Because we asked questions the world could not answer, and tried to answer them anyway. Because once upon a time, a small group of fragile hominins looked across the savannah and didn't just see predators and prey, they saw possibilities, and possibilities require space, so the brain grew, and now you carry that same organ. Inside your skull, behind your eyes, 3 pounds of questions, firing, even now, with the quiet voltage of memory and dream. So, what will you ask next? What kind of mirror will your mind become? And if you listen closely, can you hear it thinking? It is here, with those questions still echoing in the mind, that we return to the beginning. Not the beginning of thought, but the first flicker of its kindled flame. Over 2 million years ago, the land that would one day be called the Great Rift Valley cracked open beneath the sky. A vast geological wound stretching thousands of miles through eastern Africa. It tore through the land like a reminder that nothing on this planet is still for long. This was no gentle cradle of life. It was a furnace, a theatre of chaos and rebirth, where tectonic plates heaved and climates swung like pendulums. And yet, in this volatile crucible, something quietly extraordinary took root. It is easy to imagine early humans emerging into a stable Eden, surrounded by abundance and ease, evolving calmly in the comfort of sameness. But the truth, like most things in deep time, is harder, harsher, and far more revealing. The ancestors who would one day become us were forged in uncertainty. Ice ages and warming spells arrived not in centuries, but in abrupt pulses. Lakes appeared and vanished. Forests shifted into grasslands. Prey animals migrated or died out. The rules of the land changed faster than biology could follow. And so, survival came not from strength, but from adaptability. What happens to a species when the only constant is change? The answer lies in plasticity, in the ability to learn, to adjust, to improvise. And nowhere was this more urgently needed than in the volatile ecosystems of the rift. Picture a band of hominins waking to find the watering hole gone, the fruit trees barren, the wind carrying a new dryness. There was no time for genetic evolution to sculpt new limbs or tougher skin. Instead, survival passed into the hands of the mind. Those who remembered where new water could be found, those who innovated new ways to dig, to break, to reach, they lived. And slowly, those moments accumulated. Tiny neural victories spread across generations. Among these ancestors walked Homo habilis, the handyman, named for the tools they left behind. Not complex tools at first, just flakes of stone, sharp-edged and seemingly simple, but they were something new. They were intention made visible. The mind of Homo habilis had begun to fracture the world into parts, to see a rock not as a rock but as a potential edge, to split bone for marrow, to cut hide from meat, to shape the environment with purpose. This was no longer instinct. This was cognition. But what must it have felt like, to be one of the first to strike stone against stone and glimpse in the spark the beginning of thought? The answer is buried, not in words, for no words yet existed, but in fragments of flint and obsidian scattered across ancient lake beds. Each edge chipped with deliberation, each strike a quiet rehearsal of intention. These early tools were not decorative. They were lifelines, coaxed from the landscape by a species just beginning to understand that survival could be shaped by choice. Not every individual made them. Not every hand was guided by insight, but those who did, those who could learn by watching, who could improve the angle of impact, who could pass down skill without language, laid the foundation for something far larger than a tool. They laid the foundation for culture. The Rift Valley offered no promises. It stripped away the illusion of predictability. Rain failed. Herds vanished. Crops of wild tubers withered. And in that brutal school of improvisation, the brain began to favour flexibility. Not the fixed genius of instinct, but the pliable intelligence of memory and imagination. The kind of mind that could adapt when the rules changed, again and again and again, because they did. The climate of Eastern Africa, between 2 and 3 million years ago, was among the most unstable ecosystems ever inhabited by early humans. A swing of just a few degrees could shift an entire biome. How does a mind keep pace with a planet in flux? By learning to expect uncertainty. This expectation became a survival trait in itself. The brain, pressed by constant change, began to rewire its priorities. Pattern recognition surged to the forefront. Attention sharpened. Information, where the berries were sweetest, which season brought the vultures, what tool worked best on which bone, became more valuable than strength or speed. And slowly, across the rift, a cognitive revolution unfolded, not in sudden brilliance, but in quiet accumulations. We find its echoes in the sediment, in layers of ash, beneath which lie traces of habitation, scattered tools, animal bones marked by careful cuts. And though the wind has long since buried their voices, the evidence speaks. Something was watching, analysing, adapting. Something that did not accept the world as it was, but wondered what it could become. And in that wondering, the brain grew again. Not just in size, though it did swell, from earlier hominins to Homo habilis, and onward still to Homo erectus. It grew in complexity. New regions of the brain began to dominate. The prefrontal cortex, a seat of planning, decision-making, impulse control, began to flourish. It is this part of the brain that lets us imagine outcomes before they arrive, that lets us pause before we act, that lets us see beyond the now. What is the cost of such vision? To carry the burden of possibility is also to carry the weight of doubt. Because once a mind can simulate futures, it can also fear them. Once it can imagine different outcomes, it can regret. In the shifting landscapes of the rift, every choice mattered. Which direction to walk, which sound to follow, which food to trust. Each decision was a gamble against an invisible dealer, and those who could learn from failure without repeating it, those who could anticipate, hesitate, recalculate, began to pass down not just genes, but a new form of wisdom. A wisdom etched not into the body, but into the mind. It is here that intelligence, in the human sense, began to fracture from simple problem-solving. It became something layered, recursive, haunted by its own awareness. Not just, how do I survive, but how do I continue surviving when nothing stays the same? And in this mental space, this widening canyon between instinct and strategy, we see the first glimmers of narrative. Because to survive a volatile world, the mind needed to connect events, to imagine sequences, to recall and project. That is to say, it needed to tell stories to itself, This, too, is an ember, not of fire, but of foresight. And it was in these moments, whether tracking an animal that no longer followed old paths, or finding shade in a grassland where trees once stood, that the human brain began to evolve around uncertainty itself. It began to specialize in ambiguity, to hold incomplete information, to delay gratification. All these are costly adaptations requiring dense neural circuits and a long developmental period, and yet they spread, generation after generation, because in a world ruled by chaos, the ability to learn was the most stable survival trait of all. Tool use deepened. Not only were stones chipped, but techniques were remembered, sites were revisited. The tool became a medium through which thought could persist across time. Even without formal language, knowledge began to ripple outward, shaping behavior, synchronizing group actions, shared attention. That powerful ability to know what another individual is focusing on gave rise to cooperation, and cooperation gave rise to identity. What happens when a mind, pressed by its environment, begins to understand others as extensions of its own intentions? This is the quiet birth of social complexity, and it is not separate from intelligence. It is its crucible. The rift did not only create brains that could track herds or crack bones, it shaped brains that could navigate alliances, resolve conflict, and teach. Because in a changing world, the group was the buffer, the tribe was the memory. And the ability to remain part of that group, to be understood, to be trusted, to be cared for, became its own evolutionary pressure, and thus cognition stretched further still, not simply toward survival, but toward meaning, toward belonging, toward the first fragile frameworks of what it means to be human. And always, beneath this slow unfolding of the mind, the Rift Valley kept shifting, kept changing, kept reminding every living creature that permanence was an illusion. Trees fell, rivers dried, grasslands gave way to sand. Then, just as suddenly, returned. This wasn't evolution on a gentle gradient, it was evolution on a knife's edge. And because of this, the minds that could pivot, the minds that could remember, compare, and imagine something other than what was directly in front of them, those were the ones that endured. It is here we begin to understand that the brain did not grow in a vacuum. It grew in response to droughts that came without warning, to herds that changed their paths, to predators that stalked more cleverly than before. Each of these demanded something more than instinct. They demanded a rehearsal of futures. And so, through firelight and famine, through floods and hunger, through the cry of a child and the gaze of a wary elder, the brain absorbed complexity and turned it into anticipation. But complexity is not just about reaction, it's about layers. Homo habilis, and later Homo erectus, began to carry their tools with them, not just using them in one place but planning to use them in the next. This was no small thing. It meant holding a purpose in the mind beyond the moment. It meant seeing the present as incomplete. To carry a sharp flake of stone across a barren plain is to believe in a future animal, to collect food before hunger, to walk before the storm. This is thought stretched over time, and every stretch demanded a longer thread of memory, a tighter weave of logic, a greater trust in one's own mental picture of a world not yet arrived. And then there is the question of care. The archaeological record in the rift shows evidence, subtle but haunting, of individuals who were injured, even disabled, yet lived on. Toothless skulls, healed bones, signs that others had helped, had fed, had waited. What does it mean when a species not only thinks ahead, but slows down for those who fall behind? What kind of mind begins to prioritize empathy? Because care is a risk. To care is to spend energy on someone who cannot repay it. And yet, in this apparent vulnerability lies a deeper resilience. A band that protects its weakest can endure more than one that abandons them. And this endurance builds memory. It builds trust. It builds a culture where thought does not belong to the individual alone, but is shared. Through gaze, through action, through unspoken rhythm. This too is evolution, not just of the body, but of the collective mind. Not just of the clever hand, but of the attentive heart. And slowly that heart began to beat in time with a brain now dreaming in generations. Because when a mind begins to understand time, it begins to carry not just the memory of the past, but the weight of what might come. A mother digging for roots in the dry season is not only thinking of herself, she is thinking of her child's next hunger. A scout watching the sky darken is not merely noticing clouds. He is remembering a flood from years before. And when an elder's broken femur shows signs of healing, it tells us that others saw value in a life not defined by productivity alone. These are not just instincts, these are choices, and choices are where intelligence begins to turn into wisdom. The Great Rift Valley did not simply host evolution, it sculpted it. Each tremor, each drought, each thunderstorm that bent the acacia trees was a lesson, brutal but clarifying. In this place, minds were not rewarded for rigid strength. They were rewarded for flexibility, for remembering what others forgot, for noticing what others missed. The brain, through this, became not just a tool of survival, but a landscape of awareness, fluid, responsive, expanding, and so the embers burned. Not just in the hearths of Homo habilis, but within them, in their choices, in their silences, in the moment one stayed behind to help another. It was not one event, not one tool, not one generation that lit the fire. It was 1,000 small acts of recognition, of pattern, of danger, of care, of possibility, that fanned it into something more. What must it have felt like then, to be the first species to live between worlds? To hold both the present and the imagined in the same breath? To look at a river and see not only reflection but future migration? To gaze at the stars, perhaps for the first time, and feel something stir that had no name? We cannot know, but the shape of their skulls tells us the direction their minds were headed. The spread of tools across vast distances tells us they remembered where they'd been. The care shown to the vulnerable tells us they imagined futures that did not yet exist. All of this, rising from a land that never stood still, a land that demanded not just endurance, but creativity. And from that crucible of chaos and transformation, the first true sparks of our lineage glowed. The rift did not give birth to humanity with gentleness. It tested us into being, and in doing so, it left us with a legacy carved into bone and breath, a memory that the mind is not simply a product of comfort but of confrontation. That intelligence does not bloom in safety, but in storms. And even now, somewhere in your own brain, that ember glows still, waiting for change, ready to adapt, whispering the same quiet question it asked long ago. What will you do when the world changes again? Perhaps you'll look to someone beside you. Perhaps you'll wait just a moment longer for the expression on their face to shift. Perhaps survival will not come from speed or strength or silence, but from understanding. The most profound revolution in human evolution was not carved in stone, nor hunted with spear point. It unfolded in glances, in gestures, in the quiet spaces between action and reaction, the places where meaning lives. Because the human brain did not expand only to solve problems in the wild, it expanded to solve the most complex environment of all, each other. Imagine the ancient savannahs not as battlegrounds of predator and prey, but as fields of silent negotiations. Dozens of individuals, watching, inferring, predicting, remembering. Every interaction held weight. Every decision bore consequence. In these early societies, survival became a social act. Who would share their food? Who would withhold it? Who would groom? And who would turn away? Each answer required the brain to become more than a tool for foraging. It became an instrument of empathy, of deception, of story. Because even food, the most primal currency of life, began to flow differently. Among many primates, sharing is rare, transactional, limited. But among early humans, something shifted. Food was brought back to camp, passed from hand, from mother to child, from elder to youth. Cooperative foraging, the act of working together to obtain and distribute nourishment, created a loop far more intricate than hunger. It linked effort to reputation, generosity to alliance, withholding to risk. And with each passing day, minds were learning to navigate a new kind of logic. What happens to a brain when its future depends not only on nature, but on nurture? When the group becomes the buffer, the mind must become a diplomat. And so emotional intelligence took root, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Those who could read subtle changes in tone, who noticed the twitch of an eye or the tension in a jaw, gained an advantage. They could avoid conflict before it erupted. They could detect sincerity. They could anticipate betrayal. The same neural architecture that helped a forager spot ripe fruit began to light up in response to faces. The brain evolved to scan the social landscape with precision. Trust, shame, gratitude, envy. These became signals, and more than that, they became tools. But tools are only useful when the wielder understands the stakes, and in a social group the stakes were everything. Inclusion meant protection, resources, comfort. Exile meant hunger, danger, and likely death. And so, in this delicate web of relationships, a new form of intelligence emerged. Machiavellian intelligence, the ability to manipulate, to strategize, to charm, to bluff. It was not cruelty that drove this evolution, but complexity. The group demanded performance, and the mind rose to the occasion. How do you survive in a tribe where everyone else is also thinking about how you think? You learn to wear masks. You learn to watch yourself being watched. The brain, once a tool of observation, becomes an arena of reflexive thought. You begin to anticipate not just actions, but perceptions, not just what someone will do, but how they will interpret what you do. This recursive spiral, thinking about thinking, begins to dominate the social landscape, and it is not fiction, it is survival. To navigate such a world, the mind must build models of other minds. It must simulate them in real time. It must hold conflicting intentions, competing truths, divergent desires, all balanced within a fragile, fluid self. This is where the self truly emerges, not in isolation, but in reflection. In the eyes of others, we see what we are expected to be, and so, slowly, identity becomes a performance, not a lie, but a negotiation. The early human sitting beside the fire is not merely digesting calories. They are scanning faces, they are remembering slights, they are considering what to say, or whether to stay silent, and every social choice feeds back into the brain's evolution. But to perform is not the same as to deceive. True deception requires imagination. It requires the ability to model another's ignorance. And here, again, the brain deepens. Because if you can deceive, you can also empathize. You can imagine not just what someone knows, but what they feel. The same circuits that allow a hunter to predict the path of an antelope now light up in response to a child's tears. The predator becomes the parent. The toolmaker becomes the storyteller. Because yes, stories had begun to emerge, not as myths, not yet, but as explanations. As shared narratives that guided behavior. A gesture, a mimic, a reenacted hunt. These were more than entertainment. They were blueprints. They were memory held in motion. And from these primal reenactments, the roots of culture began to grow. A child watching a successful hunt is not merely observing. They are absorbing roles, strategies, values. They are learning who they are allowed to be. And slowly the group begins to define itself through these stories. Not just what it does, but why. Cooperation is no longer transactional. It becomes embedded in identity. To give is to be good. To deceive is to be dangerous. And so, morality itself begins to flicker to life, not as law, but as instinct. Shame becomes a signal. Pride becomes a motivator. These emotions, once internal weather, now guide entire societies. But what kind of brain must exist to hold such contradiction? To lie and love, to envy and forgive? A brain that is no longer just an organ, but a stage. A place where characters appear, roles are played, and outcomes are imagined before they occur. In the darkness of the ancient camp beside the fire's flicker, a new kind of intelligence is awakening, one not built for solitude, but for the impossible intricacies of us. This brain, shaped by pressure but refined by presence, began to anchor itself in the rhythms of relationship. No longer could thought exist in a vacuum. Every gesture rippled, every silence carried meaning. The group, once just a physical gathering, became a neural field, a network of overlapping awareness, minds learn to co-regulate, to adjust in synchrony. A baby's cry changed the breathing pattern of the group. A hunter's failure drew not ridicule, but recalibration. And in this dynamic interplay, the brain tuned itself to something larger than survival: synchronization. This synchronization became sacred. Shared attention, the simple act of focusing on the same object, the same event, the same idea, changed how the brain processed the world. It amplified learning, accelerated bonding, deepened trust. Two people watching the same wounded animal didn't just see the same thing. They began to feel the same stakes, and in that moment, their minds aligned. The line between self and other blurred, and the human brain, so often described in isolation, began to pulse as part of a shared consciousness. But consciousness, when mirrored, also divides, because awareness of the other brings with it awareness of hierarchy. Who leads? Who follows? Who decides when to move, when to fight, when to yield? The brain, ever adaptive, began to specialize in rank, not just brute force dominance, that had always existed, but subtle forms of influence, humor, deference, silence at the right moment. Early humans became masters of the impression management. The ability to read a room became as valuable as reading a landscape. And in that room, there were politics, not of governments, but of glances. The quiet decisions made over time. Who eats first? Who gets support in a dispute? Who is trusted when food runs scarce? These micro-calculations demanded cognitive precision. To survive in a social group, one had to remember not just names and faces, but favours and debts, not just alliances, but betrayals. Every member of the group carried a mental ledger, not written in numbers, but in emotions. And this emotional bookkeeping became part of the brain's architecture. It was here that Machiavellian intelligence flowered, the ability to manipulate social outcomes without violence. To say one thing and imply another, to pretend not to notice, to remember a kindness when it benefits you most. These are not marks of corruption. They are signs of an intelligence navigating scarcity, threat, and desire through nuance instead of force. They are the price of belonging. But doesn't this make the social brain a paradox? It grows to connect, and yet it must also defend, deflect, deceive. It seeks truth, and yet must withhold it. It desires harmony, and yet feeds on competition. What kind of mind can live in that contradiction, and still find meaning? A mind that has learned to turn tension into narrative. Because the social brain does not resolve contradictions, it holds them. It weaves them together into stories about who we are, who we were, and who we might become. In this space between self and other, truth and pretense, the earliest forms of storytelling, took shape, not as entertainment, but as strategy. Stories became the scaffolding on which societies were built. They explained why food was shared, why punishment was delivered, why trust was earned or lost. They encoded behaviour into memory. They turned fleeting choices into lasting lessons. Even without formal language, this narrative instinct echoed across actions. A reenacted hunt was not just instruction. It was myth in embryo. A gesture repeated became ritual. A sound mimicked in play became the seed of vocabulary. The brain, always hungry for meaning, began to link cause and effect with ever greater abstraction. And abstraction is the cornerstone of culture. It allows the mind to treat a symbol as real, to treat the group's identity as sacred, to treat future consequences as present guidance. And so, over thousands of years, the human brain grew not just larger, but deeper. Not just faster, but more layered. Each neural adaptation was less about reaction and more about prediction. Social life required the brain to forecast intentions, feelings, outcomes. A smile might be safety or strategy. A gift might be generosity or obligation. The brain became an engine of interpretation. But interpretation is exhausting. It demands resources, time, attention. It explains why our brains are so metabolically costly, burning through energy like a flame constantly refueling itself. This was not a mistake of evolution. It was a trade. Physical efficiency surrendered for mental simulation. And what we gained was a mind that could hold multiple truths at once. The mother who feeds another's child may feel both love and jealousy. The leader who disciplines may feel both pride and regret. These were not glitches, they were capacities. And capacities create choices. Because to hold multiple truths is to stand at a crossroads. Do you comfort or confront? Do you share or withhold? Do you speak or remain silent? These questions echoed across the savannahs not as hypotheticals, but as life or death decisions, and each one shaped the mind further. Emotional regulation, the ability to feel but not act, became as crucial as emotional intelligence. A brain that could detect anger in another now had to manage anger in itself, and that feedback loop transformed inner life. The mind was no longer just a reaction to the world, it was becoming a world of its own, vast, nuanced, unstable, evolving. Thoughts about thoughts, feelings about feelings, memories of memories, and always the pulse of the group, keeping time like a silent drumbeat. How long can such a mind exist without language to hold its weight? Only as long as it takes for pressure to become structure. And the pressure was immense. As social groups grew more complex, so too did the need for precision. Grunts and gestures could carry only so far. There had to be a way to tether abstract thoughts to shared sound, to make the invisible visible, the imagined tangible. Though true language would still take hundreds of thousands of years to crystallize, its scaffolding was already rising in the social brain, in mimicry, in repetition, in shared rhythm and shared breath. The mouth became more flexible, the breath more controlled, the brain more sensitive to tone. Communication was no longer about noise, it was about intention, and intention was everything. To say "come here" with an outstretched arm, to mimic the kill of a gazelle, to groan in pain and receive comfort. These were not random acts. They were expressions of shared reference. The brain, now sculpted by countless generations of emotional calibration, had become exquisitely tuned to these signals. One misread cue could cost alliance, food, even life. But one well-timed gesture could spark belonging. It was here, in the fertile ground of cooperative minds, that the roots of language were planted. But even more importantly, it was here that consciousness itself began to braid into something collective. The brain was no longer alone, even inside its own skull. Every thought now echoed against the expectations of others. Every belief, every desire, every fear had to account for its reception. And in doing so, thought became self-aware. Because to be misunderstood is not merely frustrating, it is dangerous. And the need to avoid that danger forced minds into ever finer distinctions. Is this face angry or tired? Is that silence an insult or a pause? The ambiguity of social life was not a flaw, it was the forge. It turned the brain into a shapeshifter, a negotiator, a poet. And from this negotiation rose something no less than humanity. Not as a fixed trait, but as a fluid performance. Intelligence as improvisation, emotion as data, morality as an evolving agreement. Early humans didn't just learn to survive together, they learned to become themselves through one another. The self, as we now know it, was not born in solitude. It was sculpted in campfires and quarrels, in embraces and betrayals, in hunger and laughter shared beneath the stars. And so the brain grew, not in silence, but in chorus. What began as a biological adaptation to climate and scarcity had become something else entirely, a mind whose shape was carved not only by environment, but by other minds, a brain that could model futures, feel another's grief, fake a smile, share a meal, tell a tale. A mind built not just to know, but to belong. And somewhere, still glowing within each of us, is that ancient need to be seen, to be understood, and to be part of something more than the self. What story are you telling now? And who is listening? It begins not with lightning, but with hunger. Long before fire was understood, it was felt as terror, as warmth, as mystery. It danced across the horizon in storms and swept through dry grass like a living thing. But eventually a moment arrived, not once, but many times, when a spark was not only feared, but kept. And that decision would change the human brain more profoundly than any other force on Earth. Because fire did not just warm our bodies, it rewired our biology. Why did our brains swell to such costly sizes? The answer may begin with cooking. Raw food takes time. It takes energy to chew, to digest, to extract what little calories are locked inside cold roots or sinewy meat. A chimpanzee might spend more than half its waking hours simply chewing, but when early humans began to cook, even with the simplest forms of fire control, something extraordinary happened. Heat broke food down before it entered the body. Digestion sped up. Nutrients became more available. The gut shrank, the teeth shrank, the jaw relaxed, and the brain grew. Because the brain is a greedy organ. It consumes more than 1/5 of the body's energy, despite making up only a fraction of its mass. It demands constant, stable fuel. And cooking, for the first time in evolutionary history, made that possible. It was not just an invention. It was a revolution in time. Less chewing meant more hours freed, more nutrients meant less foraging, and freed time became thinking time. What does the mind begin to do when it's no longer ruled by the hunger clock? It begins to notice patterns in flame, shadows in bark, the way heat dries wet grass in rings, the way smoke always follows wind. These are not grand philosophical leaps. They are the first steps toward abstraction, the birth of ideas that can outlive the moment. And fire, ever flickering, ever shifting, became the perfect tutor. Because fire is not still. It moves. It reacts. It must be watched, managed, fed. And in that constant attention, early humans began to learn more than just survival. They learned anticipation. They learned planning. And somewhere in the spaces between tending and watching, between the crackle and the glow, something even stranger began to emerge. Imagination. Can you picture it? A ring of figures seated around the fire, faces half lit, eyes reflective, bodies at ease in the warmth. For the first time in the long arc of mammalian history, sleep is not only safer, it is shared. Night no longer belongs to predators alone. The fire pushes back the dark, and with it, a new possibility: dreams uninterrupted. What happens when a mind is allowed to dream, not just in fragments, but in full uninterrupted cycles? When REM sleep becomes reliable, and memory no longer dissolves at the edge of night? How much of what we are depends on this simple act of staying warm until morning? In that warmth, the brain did not only survive, it reorganized. The protection of fire extended the night, and with it came longer bouts of deep sleep. Dreams, once broken and scattered, could now unfold more fully. And dreams, as we now understand them, are not idle fictions. They are simulations. They replay events. They consolidate memory. They blend the past with imagined futures. The dreaming brain rehearses, reframes, repairs. It solves problems without our permission. It creates associations we never intended. And it may be here, in the safety of firelight sleep, that the roots of abstract thought began to deepen. Before language, before art, before ritual, there was the dream. Fire, in this sense, was not merely a physical discovery. It was cognitive infrastructure. It changed the night from a time of terror into a time of transformation. And around it, another change took hold. The circle. The fire created a focal point. It gathered bodies inward. It turned outward-facing creatures as alert for danger, spread thin across the dark, into inward-facing ones, coalesced around a single source of light. And when eyes no longer needed to scan the horizon, they turned to each other. And what did they see? They saw faces in half-light, expressions lingering longer than the sun allowed. They saw the ways others listened, the ways they did not. They noticed who laughed, who brooded, who remembered the story from the night before. Because yes, stories were born here. Not in the hunt, not in the chase, but in the telling that followed. Fire is not just a place for warmth. It is a stage. And once the body is fed and the predators are held at bay, the mind becomes restless again. But this time, not for food, but for meaning. And so the earlier storytellers likely began with gesture, then voice, mimicking the hunt, retelling the narrow escape, honouring the dead, mocking the rival. These stories were not decorations. They were tools. They passed down strategies. They maintained group cohesion. They made sense of suffering. And they became the invisible thread binding generations. But fire demanded presence. It needed tending. It required memory. how to carry an ember, how to shield it from wind, how to rekindle from ash. These were no longer individual tasks. They were shared knowledge, passed down, practiced, refined. And in that shared labour, something rare happened. Tradition. Tradition, in the deepest sense, is memory extended beyond a single lifespan. It is the brain's refusal to forget, and fire, elusive, potent, dependent, became one of its first guardians. So what burns brighter, the flame itself, or the stories whispered beside it? In every flicker, early humans saw reflections of their own thoughts, restless, unpredictable, alive. And in watching fire, they learned to watch themselves. That act, of seeing the mind mirrored in the world, may be the first moment we truly became human, because fire was not just mastered, it became metaphor. A force outside the body that reflected the mysteries within it, flickering, ephemeral, yet capable of sustaining life, destroying danger, and revealing form. Like thought, fire danced between control and chaos, and as early humans gazed into its embers, something more than heat passed between them. They began to project, to imagine, to see things in the flames, not just literal shapes, but patterns, stories, perhaps even omens. This was not irrational. It was the stirrings of symbolic thought. The brain, now fed by cooked food and soothed by firelight sleep, was ready to map the world not just in space and sound, but in meaning. And in the fire, meaning flickered. It was transformation embodied, wood into light, bone into ash, threat into comfort. A lesson in impermanence, but also in potential. Fire taught that nothing was fixed, that the world could be changed, that a cold root could become a meal, that darkness could yield to brightness, that the unseen could be summoned. And from this transformation emerged something profound, ritual. At first, ritual may have been simple, a shared action repeated each night, stacking wood just so, choosing certain stones, honouring the firekeeper. But repetition carved pathways in the brain. It built expectancy, rhythm, collective focus. And in that shared attention, the group began to feel not just safe, but bound. The fire became a centre, not just of warmth, but of identity. Here, the earliest embers of culture began to glow. Because to control fire is to control time. You can extend the day, you can delay sleep, you can create a schedule. And with time comes sequence, story, rhythm, the fundamental components of memory. Not just what happened, but when. Not just who spoke, but why. The mind began to arrange experience into ordered chains, and in doing so, it learned to anticipate, to plan, to regret, to dream further. But this came at a cost. The same brain that could rehearse the future could now ruminate on the past. The fire extended time, but it also extended awareness. It gave the brain space to revisit pain, to worry about what-ifs, to replay social slights. Anxiety, guilt, longing. These are not flaws. They are the echoes of a mind capable of complex temporal navigation, and that navigation began beside the fire. In this light, fire was not just survival technology. It was emotional scaffolding. It offered relief from cold, yes, but also relief from isolation. Around its circle, stories became shared. Suffering became visible, and laughter, so rare in the animal kingdom, became an offering. A way to diffuse tension, to reaffirm safety, to bind hearts without needing words. So what else did the fire make possible? When the body was stilled, and the fire's pulse echoed through the night, the mind wandered into realms it could not see, and may never fully explain. It began to ask the unanswerable. What happens after death? Where does the sun go at night? What are dreams made of, and why do they linger like smoke even after waking? These questions, fragile and unformed, may have found their first breath beside the fire. For in the stillness it created, in the safety it extended, fire granted space for mystery. And mystery, unlike danger, doesn't demand reaction. It invites reflection. That too is a function of the brain, to pause, to wonder. to carry a question like a flame inside the skull. As the flickering light cast shadows on cave walls, the mind may have begun to see more than bodies. It began to see symbols, shapes that echoed something deeper, the arc of a hand in flame, the crackling rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. Perhaps it is no accident that our earliest known cave art appears near the hearth. Fire was the original projector. Throwing image onto stone, movement onto meaning, the mind took those illusions and turned them into metaphor, into memory, into myth, and from myth, guidance. Because myths are not lies, they are maps, maps of emotion, of fear, of hope, maps written by minds that knew more than they could say. The fire gave those minds a canvas, and even before paint or carving, there were stories in motion, in gesture, in silence. In the long-held look across flame, meaning passed between eyes before it passed between mouths. That was the true miracle, intersubjectivity. The recognition that what I feel, you might feel too. That what I imagine, you might understand. The fire did not just warm our bodies or light our path. It aligned our inner lives. It synchronized attention. It created a shared mind across many brains. And in that alignment, something radical took root. Belonging. To belong is not just to be included. It is to be understood. And for early humans, this understanding was survival. Around the fire, you learned who you could trust, who remembered your face, who shared your hunger. And slowly, the fire circle became more than shelter. It became self. And so, over generations, the mind began to mirror this circle in its own architecture. Networks formed not in isolation, but in webs, of memory, of association, of feeling. The default mode network, which activates when the mind wanders or reflects, may well be a descendant of firelit dreaming. It's the space where we simulate scenarios, review relationships, narrate our own lives. It is not practical. It is poetic, and it may be one of our most ancient inheritances, because what is a fire, if not poetry in matter? We tend it, we gather around it, we feed it with fragments of the world, and it responds with light, with movement, with heat, with transformation, just like thought, just like story, just like us. And still, the question lingers. Was it we who mastered fire? Or did fire master us? It's not a question of dominance, but of exchange. Because mastery implies separation, and there is none here. Fire entered us. Not literally, but metabolically, neurologically, imaginatively. It changed how we eat, how we sleep, how we dream, how we become. It altered the tempo of life. Before fire, every action was tethered to daylight. After fire, the night opened like a second sky. And in that space, the mind expanded into realms it had never dared enter. It is difficult to overstate what this meant for the brain. The rhythms of waking and resting became less rigid. The hours once lost to cold and darkness became hours of reflection, rehearsal, ritual. Fireside dreaming was not idle. It was fertile. New neural pathways formed in these twilight zones, where imagination sparked against memory, where ideas could be recombined without risk. Fire gave the brain rehearsal time for the future, and in this rehearsal came foresight. To imagine something that hasn't happened, and then act to prepare for it, is not instinct. It is vision, and vision requires not just imagination, but collaboration. Around the fire, ideas could be shared before they were tested. One person's insight became everyone's advantage. Mistakes became stories. Triumphs became legend. The mind became a communal instrument, refined not by solitude, but by sound and silence shared in rhythmic alternation. There is a reason fire remains sacred in so many cultures. It is not because it is rare, but because it is irreplaceable. Fire was our first tool of permanence in an impermanent world. It kept us warm when the sun failed. It fed us when teeth could not. It carried memory when bodies could not. It held space for grief, for joy, for beginnings and ends. It was where names were spoken for the first time, and perhaps where they were remembered for the last. And yet, its influence didn't stop at the hearth. The fire within, the metaphor we now use to describe passion, anger, insight, speaks to something deeper. Fire became a symbol because it is us, flickering, changing, consuming, illuminating. It destroys and reveals. It leaves behind both ashes and light. Our brains are not so different. They burn with energy, they flare with emotion, they leap from idea to idea like flame to dry leaf. And when tended, they too can sustain warmth through the coldest night. So what did fire give us? It gave us time. It gave us sleep. It gave us shared attention, memory, story. It gave us each other. And perhaps most surprisingly, it gave us the ability to look inward, to kindle a fire in the mind that still burns today. Even now, in cities lit by electricity, in rooms without shadows, the fire remains. It lives in our metaphors, our myths, our dreams. It is the warmth we carry forward, across generations, into the unknown. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all. We are not only the species that learned to make fire, we are the species that never stopped gathering around it. The brain is a paradox. It is the most energy-hungry organ in the human body, consuming 1/5 of all calories even when at rest. And yet, for all its costs, metabolic, structural, developmental, evolution kept investing in it, again and again. Why? Why did natural selection, so ruthless in its pruning, so efficient in its economy, choose to double down on an organ that made birth more dangerous, infancy more fragile, and survival more complex? Why, in the face of hardship, did it choose thought? To understand the weight of that decision, we must begin at its most painful consequence, the moment of birth. The human brain is so large, and the pelvis, constrained by the demands of upright walking, so narrow that birth has become a crisis. Unlike most mammals who enter the world with limbs sturdy and senses alert, human infants are born unfinished, helpless, raw. It is a biological gamble, a sacrifice of safety for potential. The obstetric dilemma, as it's known, is a razor's edge. If the baby's head were much larger, it would be fatal. If it were much smaller, it might not carry the cognitive potential that defines us. So evolution struck a desperate compromise. It sent us into the world early, our brains only partially formed, still malleable, still unfolding. We are, in a sense, born premature, creatures of prolonged dependency. What does that cost? It costs years of vulnerability, years in which the child must be carried, fed, watched, years in which survival depends not on instincts but on others. It's a burden, yes, but it's also an opportunity. Because in those years of dependence, a new kind of learning can take root, one shaped not by trial and error, but by observation, imitation, absorption. The child's mind becomes a sponge, soaking up language, gesture, pattern, intention. In this long apprenticeship, culture is not just received, it is lived. But who bears that burden? This question has no single answer, but across time and space, one figure appears again and again in the archaeological and anthropological record: the grandmother. The grandmother hypothesis suggests that post-reproductive females, a rarity in the animal kingdom, play a critical role in human survival. They feed, they teach, they protect. Their presence extends the mother's capacity, and in doing so, extends the child's chance. In societies where grandmothers are present, infant survival increases dramatically. They are not merely caretakers, they are evolutionary engines. And so, a web begins to form, not just nuclear families but extended kin. Not just pairs, but networks. The fragility of the infant necessitates cooperation, and cooperation reshapes society. It demands empathy, it rewards patience, it favours memory, and it places a premium on those who can anticipate needs, who can interpret cries, who can hold stories of healing, of danger, of food in their minds for others. But in the background, the brain still hungers, still grows, still taxes the body, still risks the mother. Why continue this costly path? What could possibly justify it? Evolution does not plan. It tinkers, it tests, it discards. And yet in humans it seems to have made a wager, one of staggering boldness. It traded early autonomy for prolonged learning. It exchanged physical robustness for cognitive plasticity. The cost was immense. More dangerous births, longer childhoods, heightened nutritional demands. But the payoff was profound. Flexibility, imagination, foresight. The brain, in its extended infancy, became not just a processor of experience, but a sculptor of possibility. This sculpting was not done in solitude. The long years of dependency gave rise to an unusual phenomenon in the animal world: collective child rearing. Alloparenting, it's called, caregiving by individuals other than the biological mother. In humans, this included not only fathers and grandmothers, but siblings, aunts, uncles, even unrelated members of the group. The child became a shared project, and with that sharing came shared emotion, shared investment, shared thought. It is no coincidence that the neural substrates for social cognition expanded in parallel with infant fragility. To survive, humans had to read each other, had to infer intentions, decode expressions, anticipate needs, not only to care for offspring, but to coordinate care with others. The social brain, we might say, did not evolve in spite of our weakness. It evolved because of it. But again, the question lingers. Could this have happened with smaller brains? Could the same results have been achieved with less risk, less energy expenditure, less maternal mortality? Not necessarily, because bigger, in the case of brains, does more than store. It transforms. Brain size correlates with the number of neurons, particularly in the cerebral cortex, where abstract thought, language, and social reasoning reside. But more important than sheer neuron count is what those neurons are doing, how they connect, how flexibly they rewire. In larger brains, there's more room for complexity, more potential for internal simulation, for the rehearsal of possible futures, the modelling of others' minds, the weaving of intricate cause and effect. And perhaps this is the real reason evolution kept choosing thought, not for hunting prowess, not for brute strength, but for its compressive power. A large brain lets you run the world as a model inside your head. You can test actions before committing. You can learn from mistakes without repeating them. You can imagine what another feels before they speak. You can lie. You can forgive. You can remember not just what was, but what it meant. These are not minor advantages. They are the foundation of civilization. And yet, the cost never went away. Even today, childbirth remains perilous. Human infants still arrive unfinished, and parental burnout is real. The brain's appetite still drains the body. The trade-off still pulses beneath every generation. It was never an easy path. It was a path of burden, of blood, of time. So again we ask, was it worth it? And the answer, whispered in every lullaby, every shared glance, every story passed down, may be this: it wasn't just about surviving, it was about mattering. Because thought, once ignited, does more than extend life. It deepens it. A brain large enough to reflect is a brain large enough to care. Not just about others, but about what happens to others. A mother doesn't just protect her child from predators, she imagines the loss before it happens. A father doesn't simply feed his kin, he wonders if he's enough. Grandmothers worry, not because something is wrong, but because the mind now lives in time, stretching backwards into memory, forwards into dread. This emotional depth is part of the cost. A bigger brain is not just a more capable brain, it is a more vulnerable one. It feels more, it loops more, it suffers in advance. But it also loves more. It stays awake beside the fire when others sleep. It mourns the dead. It finds meaning where there is no guarantee of it. And yet, for all this magnificence, there remains a practical question. Was bigger really better? Because bigger brains require more energy, more childbirth risk, more years of development. They make demands on the individual and the group. They increase dependency. So is it possible that evolution went too far? That, having stepped onto the escalator of brain expansion, we became trapped in a feedback loop, selecting for brains that selected for more brain-friendly environments, which then supported bigger brains again? Some scientists call this the runaway brain hypothesis. The idea that brain size became its own reward, spiraling upward not because it was always advantageous, but because it kept feeding into traits that favoured itself. Language, art, planning, teaching. All of these created an environment in which bigger brains made more sense, and so evolution obliged. But bigger isn't everything. Dolphins have large brains, so do elephants, and yet their cognitive paths diverged from ours. What matters is not size alone, but structure. How efficiently a brain can process information. How it balances energy needs with adaptive flexibility. In this light, the human brain is not merely large, it is selectively refined. Dense in the prefrontal cortex, rich in association areas, lateralized, yet integrated. It is an organ not just of reaction, but of representation. Still, efficiency comes at a cost. The brain's computational style favours abstraction, which means we often mistake our models for reality. We think in categories, we project intentions, we suffer from illusions, biases, memories we can't control. Bigger brains bring more room for error, and yet, despite all this, or perhaps because of it, we endure. We build cradles and burial grounds. We invent rituals to hold our fear. We invent language to hold each other. We invent story to make the cost make sense. Because in the end, the brain is not a tool we wield. It is a burden we carry, lovingly, painfully, hopefully, across generations. And with every child born into this fragile world, we ask the same question again. Can you carry the weight of thought? It's not just a question posed to infants born into the world. It's the silent promise that every generation makes to the next. That this long, costly experiment in neural expansion, in being born too early, needing too much, dreaming too deeply, is still worth continuing. That the burdens we pass on also carry within them the seeds of something beautiful. Something lasting. Because fragility begets connection. An infant who cannot survive alone draws others in. It pulls threads of care across the social fabric. Parents learn patience. Siblings learn cooperation. Communities learn empathy. The very helplessness of the child becomes the first teacher. Not just for the child, but for those who surround them. The brain, too large to be cradled by instinct alone, must be guided by voices, gestures, hands. And in this guidance, bonds are formed. Bonds that do not vanish once the child grows, but echo across a lifetime. This is how a species becomes social at its core, not just by living in groups, but by needing one another to survive development itself. It is perhaps no coincidence that our brains are most plastic, most able to change, during this extended childhood. It's as if evolution left the doors open longer, giving experience more time to shape what biology merely outlined. And in this openness lies both risk and wonder. Because thought is not uniform. It depends on environment, culture, nourishment, presence. A brain starved of interaction, of touch, of meaning, will not flourish. But a brain steeped in story, in song, in safety, can become a cathedral of connection, a site not only of intelligence, but of wisdom. And that brings us back to the deeper meaning of the weight of thought. Yes, it is literal, in metabolic cost, in the dangerous geometry of the birth canal, in the time and energy spent raising children. But it is also figurative. To think is to carry memories, regrets, hopes, responsibilities. To think is to bear witness to what was, to what might be, to who we are when no one is watching. This is not a burden every species chooses. Some live by instinct alone, efficient and immediate. Others by ritual, by hierarchy, by role. But humans, we live by story. We ask not just how to survive, but why. We seek pattern in chaos, meaning in pain, redemption in time. And that seeking, that sacred unrest, is a function of the very organ that weighs us down. Because if our brains made life harder, they also made it deeper. We don't just feel joy. We reflect on it. We anticipate it. We grieve its loss in advance. We don't just suffer. We search for what suffering means. We find beauty in fleeting things because we know they end. We look at our children and see not just who they are, but who they might become. And so, the cycle begins again. A child is born, too early for the world, their neck unsteady, their vision still forming, their cries unanswered by instinct alone. But around them, a world stirs to attention. Hands reach out, eyes soften, voices murmur names that carry histories, and beneath it all, unseen yet undeniable, the collective wisdom of 1,000,000 years stands ready, to lift, to teach, to hold. This is what the human brain has done. Not only grown larger, but grown longer in its arc. It reaches forward, through generations, linking the fragility of birth to the strength of legacy. It is not the individual mind alone that matters, but the networked mind passed hand to hand like fire. And in that long arc, something astonishing has emerged. Because the brain does not only recall, it dreams. It imagines what could be. It holds worlds that do not yet exist, and walks through them in advance. It asks questions evolution never needed answered. What is right? What is beautiful? What is true? It builds temples not for shelter, but for awe. It writes symphonies that serve no purpose except to move another being to stillness or tears. It sends probes into the stars, not for survival, but for knowing. These are not traits of efficiency. They are symptoms of excess, the strange byproducts of a brain that grew beyond what was strictly necessary. But it is in that excess that humanity finds its soul. And yet the cost remains. Women still labour with pain sharpened by evolution's compromise. Children still need years of support before they can speak in full sentences, think abstractly, find their place. Societies still struggle to care for the vulnerable, still falter under the demands of raising the next mind. The weight of thought is not evenly distributed. It presses harder in some lives than others, but even in that pressure, something precious is forged. The very fact that we ask whether it was worth it, that we reflect on the burden, is itself evidence of what we gained. No other species wonders aloud if it should exist. No other brain surveys its own architecture, mapping neurons like galaxies, searching for meaning in folds of grey matter. No other animal builds mirrors that reach into time. The weight of thought is not a flaw. It is a frontier. And each time a child takes their first breath, each time a question is asked for which there is no answer, each time a person dreams something new into being, we carry that weight forward, not as punishment, but as promise. Because thought, heavy as it may be, is what makes us human. It is the price we pay to look at the stars and ask not just what they are, but why they shine. It is the burden that lets us hold not just tools, but meaning, not just fire, but memory, not just survival, but wonder. They left not in conquest, but in quiet necessity. Across an Africa cracking with heat and time, early humans began to wander, not because they sought empire, or because they imagined the edges of maps, but because the rains had failed again, because a river dried into silence, because the game moved, because a child was hungry, and with each step away from the familiar, the brain became something else. Not just a machine for memory, but a compass without a needle. A vessel for carrying the invisible. What does it mean to walk into the unknown and remember the way back? For the first time, survival required not just reaction, but prediction. The forests gave way to deserts, the savannah to chill, the days to lengths unmeasured in ancestral time. No longer could the mind rely on instinct alone. It had to build maps, not of lines and symbols, but of meaning. Mental models of space and sequence, landmarks of sound and scent, patterns of movement written into synapse and story. These weren't simply wanderers, they were cognitive cartographers, etching invisible trails across the cortex. But what kind of memory can survive 1,000 miles? Not the memory of details, but the memory of relationships, the placement of one hill against another, the timing of a migrating herd. The curve of a coastline felt more than seen, and so the brain became a place where landscapes lived, where territory could be summoned in the dark and paths through danger rehearsed before they were walked. Navigation, then, was not a skill, it was a revolution of thought, and yet, even maps are useless if they vanish with the maker. So something else began to stir alongside these spatial intuitions. Language. Not the simple signals of other animals, but the braided thread of syntax and symbol that could anchor memory outside the mind. Words became portable survival. They carried warnings, recipes, directions. They stored not just the where, but the how, the when, the why. Knowledge, once locked inside individual minds, began to flow between them. What happens when thought can be passed from voice to voice across generations? It becomes culture. Not in the modern sense of art or artifact, but in the older, more vital sense. Culture as a memory engine, a collective mind stitched from many. And for those early migrants, this was not optional. To survive exile, to endure snow when your lineage knew only heat, required more than tools. It required continuity, a sense of pattern, of rhythm, of response. It required that the past remain alive even as the world transformed. But this new knowledge wasn't just practical. To remember where the river bends, you must also remember the stories told beside it. To predict when the animals return, you must feel the season in your bones. Slowly, imperceptibly, survival and imagination began to entwine. The world became not just a place to inhabit, but a thing to understand, a presence to interpret. And in that act of interpretation, a new kind of mind was born. It was a mind no longer tethered only to the present. It could project, could replay, could rehearse, and most importantly, it could tell. The telling, the sharing of internal worlds, became a survival tool as crucial as fire or flint. Through it, the exile became manageable, and the unknown, if not familiar, at least intelligible. Words carried not just the weight of facts, but the tone of caution, the ache of memory, the rhythm of seasons. This is how landscapes became stories. As humans crossed into the Levant, then fanned into Eurasia's bone-pale steppes, they were confronted by environments utterly alien to their ancestral past. Ice, snow, conifers, herds that moved with the cold, not the sun, animals that could not be tracked the same way. Plants that healed or harmed, indistinguishable without experience. Here, language wasn't a luxury, it was infrastructure. A bridge built across generations, allowing a child to benefit from wounds they'd never received, to heed dangers they'd never encountered. And so, culture expanded to hold not just places but possibilities. The stories told by the fire were not merely entertainment, they were simulations, training exercises for the brain, encounters with what might happen, wrapped in the safety of narrative, a tale about a forgotten crossing point, a legendary predator, a time when the snows came early. In these loops of imagination, listeners rehearsed reactions, made emotional connections, learned not just what happened, but what it felt like, and that emotional memory became key. Because as the climates grew harsher, so too did the need for planning. Seasonal shifts became brutal. Misreading a storm could mean death, missing a migration, starvation. The human brain began to internalize time in new ways, not just the daily rhythm of sun and sleep, but long cycles, of moon, of tide, of thaw and freeze. The mind learned to anticipate rhythms it could not see, and in doing so, it drew tighter to the land. You could no longer think in terms of simple cause and effect. Now the brain had to think in terms of delayed consequence, of cyclical return. The way a hunter's failure in autumn could mean a famine in spring, the way the bloom of one flower signalled the movement of distant prey. And this demanded a kind of intelligence far beyond immediate survival. It required an ecological mind, a brain attuned to pattern and patience. But this attunement wasn't cold calculation. It was felt. Early humans began to form a connection to place that was almost spiritual. Certain valleys were trusted, certain winds held meaning. The tilt of a hill, the flight of birds, the smell of wet stone, all of it became information. But more than that, it became relationship, a way of being with the land, not just on it, a way of listening, even when no sound was made. In exile, the earth itself became the teacher, and we, its students, began to change, not just in how we moved, but in how we knew. Knowledge became something ambient, embedded, cued by the land. A certain rock formation meant water. A sudden silence in the canopy meant a predator. A bloom of certain mosses meant the return of cold. Memory ceased to be abstract and became anchored in place, in scent, in sky, in the tilt of the light. Our minds became instruments for tuning into the world's cycles, This attunement gave rise to something deeper than mere adaptation. It gave rise to belonging. When you know the land not just by what it offers but by what it remembers, something profound shifts in your awareness. You begin to walk not only to find, but to honour. The trail is no longer just a path through wilderness. It's a narrative. Each bend tells of migration, each clearing a campsite layered with the smoke of ancestors. In this way, exile became inheritance, and memory a landscape passed hand to hand. Language evolved to hold this connection. It became textured, multi-layered. Words encoded directions but also danger. Names referred to locations but also events. The place where the lion waited. The hill that feeds in the red moon. These were not poetic flourishes. They were practical mnemonics, memory hooks that fused information with meaning. The symbolic capacity of the human mind deepened, not as an ornament of culture but as a technology of survival. And with symbol came ritual, patterns of behaviour repeated not out of superstition but out of deeply rooted knowledge. That timing matters, that sequence matters. Certain foods gathered only after the first frost. Ceremonies to honour the returning herds. Songs that measured distance in rhythm. Even the placement of stones may have served as temporal anchors, ways to mark the passage of moons, migrations, or deaths. The human brain, now saturated with abstraction, began to see not just space and time, but meaning in space and time. And from that perception arose something new, identity shaped by place. This wasn't nationalism or ownership in the modern sense. It was embeddedness. To be human was to be of somewhere, not just genetically, but cognitively. A people of the river, a people of the wind. To lose the land was to lose a part of the self, because the land held your stories, your patterns, your memory. And perhaps this is what exile truly meant. Not simply walking away from home, but walking into a world where the stories were not yet known, where every step required invention. But invention, in this era, did not mean ego or dominance. It meant listening. It meant watching what changed when you slept. It meant learning from ice, from bark, from bone. In a very real way, the world became our library, but only if we approached it with humility. Because exile was not a punishment. It was an invitation to remember differently. To leave home was to lose the instructions etched into blood and bone. But in that loss, something else began to stir. A new kind of learning. Not inherited through instinct, but earned through observation. The rhythms of the world grew more complex with each new ecosystem encountered. In the vast steppe, wind carved open landscapes into endless repetition. In the dense forests of Southeast Asia, visibility dropped and sound became king. In high alpine regions, oxygen thinned and fire became sacred. Each place demanded a new language of the senses. Each migration sculpted a new mind. And so, the cognitive map, once a personal compass, became increasingly communal. Navigation was not merely an individual task, but a shared endeavour. Landmarks were recalled not in isolation but aloud, in dialogue. Knowledge became layered. A grandparent's memory of a migration, a child's correction from last season, a hunter's new path discovered through accident. This distributed cognition formed what some researchers call a cognitive ecology, a system where memory lives not just in brains, but in relationships. It is here that the mind becomes externalized, not just in language, but in ritual sites, in worn footpaths, in painted symbols on stone. These were not decorations, they were storage. Memory caches encoded in the world itself, designed to be read, interpreted, re-remembered. To stand before a rock shelter etched with ochre was to step into dialogue with minds long gone. A continuity of cognition, stretched across generations, and central to this continuity were the seasons. Not the predictable calendar-bound seasons of agriculture, but the volatile, breathless cycles of a wild earth. Spring came differently each year. Winters stretched or snapped without pattern. And so early humans adapted not by rigid schedule, but by attunement. They watched the sky with a mind full of stories. They felt the air, smelled the soil, followed the pulse of animals not just with eyes, but with imagination. It wasn't merely, what is the season? It was, what does this season mean? And in that question, we see the dawn of symbolic cognition taking root, because to understand a season is to recognize that it is not a thing, but a pattern within a world, a system of relationships unfolding in time, and to live within that system, to respond rather than control, required a humility and precision that modernity has often forgotten. In these early exiles, the earth taught that meaning is not fixed. The same valley could be bounty or barren depending on context. The same animal could be predator or prey depending on time. And so, the mind began to hold not just answers, but contingencies. If this, then that. 1,000 small algorithms unfolding in the dark. From these, culture did not just survive, it flourished. Not in spite of exile, but because of it. Displacement was not a detour in human evolution, it was a crucible. Migration, with all its hardships, refined the architecture of thought. The challenges of new worlds asked for something unprecedented, a brain that could simulate the unfamiliar, collaborate beyond kin, and remember what no individual could live long enough to learn alone. In this way, every step into unknown territory sharpened the human mind into something vast, elastic, and deeply social. But perhaps most importantly, exile kindled the root of empathy. To survive, humans had to share more than food or tools. They had to share perspective. I went that way and nearly froze. Go around the ridge. The fruit looks ripe, but my sister grew sick. Each utterance carried not just information, but a recognition that another's experience was worth listening to, that their story might become your survival. It was not just intelligence that grew in the cold winds of migration, it was compassion as a cognitive strategy. And in this widening of perspective, humanity encountered a powerful paradox. The farther we wandered from our origins, the more we needed to invent origins anew. We sang to the stars, mapped meaning onto constellations, buried our dead as if to remind ourselves we belong. Even in lands that knew nothing of us, we left signs, carvings, pigments, sculptures of mammoths and gods, acts of memory not just for others but for ourselves. In alien landscapes, culture became a kind of home, and so the brain adapted once more, not just to hold facts but to hold identity. Not just where are we, but who are we here? This question echoed across ice and forest, mountain and shore, and it demanded ever more complex answers. Answers built not from instinct, but from ritual, myth, cooperation, memory. And each time a group settled, even temporarily, a kind of mind place formed, a cognitive landscape shaped by both environment and imagination. This is where the human mind began to stretch beyond survival. It began to ponder why things happened, why the reindeer didn't return, why the storm fell early, why children die and the moon vanishes and then reappears. These were not idle questions. They were reflections of a brain no longer content with the immediate, a brain that held space for doubt, for wonder, for sorrow, a mind that had become, in exile, something more than adaptive. It had become conscious, and in that consciousness, in that slow, beautiful accumulation of memory and metaphor, humanity turned the unfamiliar into meaning, not by conquering the world, but by remembering it together, step by step, voice by voice, painting by painting. The exile gave us stories. Stories gave us time, and time, once carried only in sun and shadow, became something we could feel inside our very thoughts. The mind was no longer just in the skull. It was in the land, in the seasons, in each other, and it would never return to silence again. What does it mean to leave a mark on the world when your voice will never be heard, your name never known, your body dust long before the story begins? Somewhere, between the flicker of a flame and the echo of footfalls in a cave, humans began to do something no other creature on Earth had done before. They began to remember in symbols. They began to intentionally make the past visible to the future. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold not only of cognition, but of identity. The ochre-stained palms on a cave wall were not just pigment. They were a declaration. I was here, and perhaps more quietly, I remember. But how do we trace this shift, from instinct to intention, from action to meaning? Archaeologists point to artifacts, bone fragments, pigment residues, shaped stones, and broken shells. These are the fingerprints left by vanished minds. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, deep beneath layers of sand and time, lies a piece of ochre over 70,000 years old, carved with a crosshatch pattern. It is not random. It is not natural. It is a message, but one we no longer know how to read. What makes it astonishing is not its form, but its purpose. It did not serve utility, but meaning. And in this single shard of ochre lies the whisper of a symbolic mind awakening. Why would a species struggling to survive pause to scratch patterns into stone? The answer may lie not in need, but in memory. Early Homo sapiens, faced with the instability of climate, the chaos of migration, and the fragility of life, began to realize that survival alone was not enough. You had to remember how you had survived. You had to share that memory in forms that outlasted the body. It was not enough to hunt. You had to know when and where. It was not enough to bury the dead. You had to explain why. And so, around hearths and within caves, humans started to project the inside world of thought onto the outside world of form. The result was a slow bloom of symbolic behaviour. Incised bones, beads of shell, ground pigments, burials with red ochre and antlers placed deliberately. What do these gestures say about the mind that made them? That it had begun to grasp abstraction, that it could hold in its imagination both the visible and the invisible, the now and the nevermore. That it had begun to ask what lasts when we are gone, and that question, more than any tool or weapon, may have been the true ignition of the human story. For what these markings reveal is not simply intelligence. They reveal intention, not to act, but to be seen, to be remembered, to externalize what was once locked behind the eyes, to turn the fragile spark of thought into a fire that could be carried through generations, a fire of memory, a fire of meaning, a fire that would not go out. Because once memory had a vessel, something irreversible had occurred. The mind was no longer confined to the individual. It could be stored in pigment, in gesture, in ritual. And more than that, it could be shared. This is the moment, perhaps, when culture was born. Not merely the passing of knowledge from one person to another, but the creation of shared meaning that could transcend time, even death. Consider a burial. To modernize a grave is a universal symbol of care, of grief, of continuity. But in prehistory, its emergence marks an astonishing leap. There is no practical need to place the dead in a particular posture, with objects, with ochre or shells. Yet across vast regions, from the Levant to Siberia to the high caves of Spain, we begin to see these gestures repeating, bodies laid in fetal positions, tools or pigments beside them, children buried with beads. These are not accidents, they are acts of belief. But belief in what? Perhaps not gods, not yet, but in significance. In the idea that death is not simply an end, but a transformation. That the life of a person leaves more than bones. It leaves meaning. And so, the act of burial becomes an act of memory, a collective agreement that this person mattered, that their story is not erased by silence, that their departure deserves context. It is here that identity is born, not in the biological sense, but in the symbolic. We begin to see signs that individuals were perceived as unique, as members of a group not just by function, hunter, gatherer, child, but by relation. The grandmother with a broken hip cared for long past her ability to walk. The young man buried with painstakingly worked tools. The child adorned with ornaments crafted by adult hands. These acts say, you are more than useful, you are loved, you are part of us. And so, belief widens. It stretches beyond the immediate into the ancestral. It begins to shape behaviour not just around survival, but around meaningful survival. You do not simply eat, you share. You do not simply die, you are mourned, you are remembered. And in this remembering, you are kept alive, in some new and shimmering sense. Perhaps not in flesh, but in story, in ritual, in the minds of those who remain. The memory keepers of prehistory were not priests or artists in the modern sense. They were mothers, children, elders, companions, people who placed pigment in the firelight, people who traced spirals in the stone, people who held the hands of the dying and then returned to carve something, anything, into the walls. They did not write names, but they wrote presence. They left the imprint of thought in material, and in doing so they declared a profound truth, that the mind could reach beyond the skull, into the world, and into time. And nowhere is that truth more hauntingly visible than in the caves. The painted sanctuaries of Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira and others still ripple with breath from tens of thousands of years ago. Within their stone bellies, the first memory theatres of humanity flicker to life. These were not random scribbles. They were curated, chosen, layered with precision and perspective. Bison thunder across walls in motion. Horses gallop alongside hands. Stags peer from behind undulating curves in the rock, placed not merely for depiction, but for experience. To step into these caves is to step inside the ancient mind. But more than that, it is to enter its imagination. Because painting an animal is not the same as seeing it. To draw it, to depict it, is to hold it in mind, long after it has vanished into the brush. It is to abstract from experience, to transform a fleeting encounter into an enduring symbol. That is not instinct. That is art. And with art comes the first clear sign that humans did not simply live in the world, they lived in a story about it. This, perhaps, is the true power of symbolic behaviour. It allowed humans to rehearse reality, to imagine, to remember what was, to speculate on what could be. And those speculations were not idle. They became tools, not for hunting or cutting, but for sense-making. When pigments were ground and blown through reeds to create negative handprints, something else happened, a moment of connection. This was me, it says. I was here. But not just as an individual, as a member of something larger, because dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hands appear in these caves, overlapping, reaching, clustered. Not signatures, but witnesses. Together they declared, we are part of this world, we see it, we remember it, and we will leave something behind. And from those acts of visual memory came another leap, the creation of shared internal worlds. When a child grew up seeing the same animals on the walls year after year, the cave itself became a memory palace, a place where experience, teaching and myth intertwined. The visual became narrative, the narrative became cultural. It is here that culture itself becomes external memory, a distributed system, not written in books, but in stone, pigment, gesture, ritual. A system so powerful that it could carry ideas across centuries, even millennia. When someone walked into a cave and saw the red silhouette of a bison, they did not need to meet the painter. The memory had already been given. It had already been kept. And so a new kind of inheritance began. One not of genes, but of meanings. Through ochre, through symbols, through story. The memory keepers had become time travellers, and we, their descendants, still walk through the shadows they lit. The act of memory, once rooted in survival, which buries not to eat, which tracks to follow, had evolved into something more fluid and mysterious. It had become collective, it had become intentional, a kind of second inheritance system built not from DNA but from meaning, one that moved across generations through stories, rituals, gestures and marks left behind. This is the essence of culture, and culture, in its earliest forms, was memory made visible. It allowed a human mind to borrow the insight of another. A child could hear a tale from an elder about a time they did not live through. A group could mimic a ritual handed down from those whose names were long forgotten. And more importantly, memory could now be decoupled from experience. You didn't have to live through a drought to know how to prepare for one. You didn't have to meet an ancestor to feel that you came from them. Through culture, memory escaped the limits of biology. And this external memory did something else. It freed the brain. Because once knowledge could be stored outside the mind itself could evolve new priorities. It could become more reflective. It could specialize. It could innovate. The brain no longer had to carry everything. It had begun to delegate. To the shape of a tool. To the grooves in a shell. To the smoke of a funeral pyre. To a handprint in a cave. This outsourcing of memory may seem abstract, but it was profound. It allowed human groups to develop increasingly complex social structures belief systems, and technologies without each individual needing to reinvent them. Knowledge became modular, traditions became replicable, and across time this gave rise to what we now recognise as civilization's backbone, cultural continuity. And within that continuity, another transformation took place. The self became mirrored. To remember someone, you must distinguish them. To mourn someone, you must have known them as unique. To preserve a moment, a burial, a symbol, a story, you must already feel that it mattered, that your life and the lives of those around you are not interchangeable, that they are irreplaceable. This is the root of identity. And it begins not with ego, but with connection. We remember not just to preserve the past, but to belong to it. In that sense, the earliest symbolic acts are not expressions of dominance or power. They are expressions of longing. Longing to be known, longing to be seen, longing for the ephemeral to be made eternal. So when we look at those ochre marks or that careful shell bead strung beside a skeleton, we are not looking at relics of utility. We are looking at the first libraries, the first poems, the first quiet, trembling steps toward eternity, not carved in stone to be shouted across time, but whispered. And the miracle is, we still hear them, not as language, not as voice, but as resonance. The symbols they made may no longer speak in clear syllables, but their intent lingers like embers, glowing softly in the deep cave of our awareness. We feel it when we light a candle at a gravesite, when we tell stories to children about people they'll never meet, when we reach for photographs in a quiet moment, trying to keep someone's presence alive. These are modern rituals, yes, but their roots twist deep into Paleolithic soil. What was once ochre and ash has become ink and digital code. But the impulse is unchanged, to be remembered, to give memory, to make the mind visible. And what does this tell us in the long arc of human evolution? That intelligence, for all its technical brilliance, was never purely about solving problems. It was never just about planning hunts or building tools or tracking seasons. Our brains did not grow simply to process data. They grew to process meaning, to encode the invisible, to stitch together time, self, and others into a single fabric of awareness. Symbolic behaviour was not an afterthought. It was a revolution, a slow one, quiet, steady, and world-changing. It turned the mind inside out. What once lived only within neurons now lived in paint, in stone, in ritual space. We learned to project ourselves, and that projection, through symbols, stories, ceremony, changed not only how we understood the world, but how we understood ourselves. The very act of reflection, of remembering, of honouring something lost. These became sacred technologies, and like fire, they were passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, camp to camp, until memory was no longer just a whisper in the dark, but a tradition, a light carried forward. So when we ask, why did humans evolve such massive, energy-hungry brains? Perhaps part of the answer is this, because we had something to remember, and someone to remember it for. Not just how to survive, but why survival mattered. Not just what was lost, but what it meant. And through this slow blossoming of symbolic behaviour, we became not only thinkers, but witnesses. Not only doers, but dreamers. Not only beings in time, but creators of it. We walked through the world with our minds half in the past, half in possibility, and that duality became our greatest strength. The memory keepers of prehistory did not know what future would inherit their marks, but they knew someone would, and they made room for us, in pigment, in prayer, in silence. Their fire burns still, and so the journey continues, deeper into the corridors of our origins, into the buried chambers of our own minds, where every symbol left behind is a map, and every mark a mirror, quietly asking us, do you remember? Will you carry this too? For most of our existence, we were not alone. To walk the earth as a thinking, feeling hominin was not a solitary privilege, but a shared inheritance. The tall grasses of the Eurasian steppe, the shaded woodlands of Europe, the wind-carved ranges of Central Asia, all were once home to other beings who stood upright, made tools, buried their dead, and carried thoughts behind their brow ridges. Some looked enough like us to pass unnoticed in a crowd. Others were smaller, more robust, shaped by climates we never endured. But what united us was not our difference, but our mystery. The mystery of thought, of fire, of choice. We call them Neanderthals. Denisovans, archaic cousins with minds of their own, and minds we barely understand. How do you measure a mind across extinction? Their skulls, fossilized in silence, tell part of the story. The Neanderthal brain was as large as ours, sometimes larger, over 1,500 cubic centimetres of potential, cradled in a low, elongated vault. Different proportions, yes, with more volume at the back of the skull, hinting at visual and spatial specialization. But size alone is not destiny. It is structure and timing and how neurons dance together in patterns of thought. Our brains may have been more efficient, more plastic in development, but is that why they vanished and we remained? What does it mean to share the earth with minds you can't quite read? For nearly 400,000 years, Neanderthals thrived in the colder latitudes of Europe and Western Asia. Their world was sculpted by glacial cycles, vast, rolling ice sheets that advanced and retreated with ancient breath. They learned to survive in a land of scarcity and bone-deep cold, crafting tools from stone and antler, hunting massive prey, and likely using fire with the same reverence we did. Denisovans, more elusive still, left only fragments, a molar, a finger bone, traces of DNA. But those fragments whisper of a vast range stretching from the highlands of Siberia to the caves of Tibet. These were not shadows of us, they were parallel stories. And yet, one story ended. It wasn't abrupt. There was no single battlefield, no apocalyptic flood. It was a slow fading, a quiet dimming of hearths and heartbeats. Tens of thousands of years ago, as Homo sapiens spread outward from Africa, we began to encounter them. Sometimes we lived alongside them, sometimes we learned from them, and sometimes we left behind more than footprints. Because the truth is not just about survival, it's about entanglement. We did not merely replace them, we absorbed them. Between Homo sapiens and these ancient cousins, there was contact, intimacy, the sharing of blood. Today, in the cells of billions, live the echoes of those unions. Up to 2% of the genome of most people of Eurasian descent comes from Neanderthals. Up to 6% in some populations from Denisovans. We are not pure, we are not singular, we are composite creatures, living proof of a deeper question. What happens when minds collide not in war but in kinship? The evidence lies not just in bones or genomes, but in the subtle contours of our biology. Genes inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans shape the way some of us respond to altitude, how our immune systems fight pathogens, how our skin reacts to sunlight. These gifts, or burdens, are not conscious, but they are reminders that evolution is not a tidy staircase, but a braided river. Branches merge, diverge, disappear, only to rise again in distant tributaries of the future. This braided river is where empathy began to evolve into something more complex, because to live alongside another hominin, not a predator, not prey, but something almost you, required a special kind of mind, a flexible one, a mind capable of drawing boundaries but also blurring them, capable of recognizing difference but also of reaching across it. And the archaeological traces we found, shared tool traditions, overlapping cave sites, possible signs of exchanged ornamentation, suggest that these weren't merely chance encounters. They were relationships. Some may have been peaceful, some may have ended in violence, but all were deeply human. What makes us different, then, is not simply that we survived, it's how we survived. Homo sapiens didn't outlive Neanderthals because we were stronger, or even smarter in a raw sense. We survived in part because of something harder to define, cognitive flexibility. Where Neanderthals had sophisticated toolkits honed over millennia, we experimented restlessly. Where they seemed to favour particular patterns, specific prey, familiar methods, we explored variation. We traded across long distances, we mixed materials. We adapted symbols to new uses. We adjusted quickly, not just across space but across time. And in an unstable climate, this flexibility became everything. It shaped our language, it shaped our culture, and it shaped our ability to learn, not just individually but socially, to imitate, to teach, to revise. This recursive learning how to learn, and teaching how to teach, may have been the critical threshold. It allowed ideas to not only survive, but to improve. Over generations, this transformed isolated ingenuity into cumulative innovation. It let us build not just tools, but traditions, not just fire, but stories. And those stories became a vessel for memory, morality, and migration, carrying us across continents and into the future. Neanderthals likely had elements of this, perhaps even much of it. But our edge was not one trait, it was a pattern, cultural innovation woven into cooperative intelligence, and this raises a harder, quieter truth. We did not just survive the others, we may have outlasted them because we were more like them than they were like each other, more hybrid, more entangled, more willing to cross lines, not just geographically, but biologically. And as we crossed, we carried with us fragments of other minds, their genes, yes, but also their shadows, their echoes, their vanished songs. Because even as Homo sapiens moved outward, into Ice Age Europe, into the frozen plateaus of Central Asia, into highlands and coasts, Neanderthals and Denisovans had already called home. We were not just explorers, we were inheritors, and memory, even when unspoken, leaves a shape. Perhaps this is why some of the earliest art in Europe, handprints, animals drawn in ochre and charcoal on cave walls, appears within the very regions where Neanderthals once thrived. Perhaps we did not invent all of it from nothing. Perhaps we watched, perhaps we learned, or perhaps their way of seeing the world left a quiet template behind, one that we absorbed without knowing. The archaeological record is sparse, but it is not silent. In Shanidar Cave, Iraq, a Neanderthal was buried with flowers. In El Sidron, Spain, their molars bear traces of medicinal plants. In France, evidence of eagle talon ornaments, perhaps necklaces or status markers. These are not the relics of brutes, they are signs of creatures with inner lives. So why did they vanish? There are no clear villains in this part of the story. No moment where one species eradicates the other. The timeline stretches over thousands of years, a long twilight rather than a sharp end. Climate change played a part. So did low population density. So did the simple math of small numbers over deep time. In some places, Neanderthals may have held on longer than we once thought. In pockets, in valleys, in memory. But over time, their cultures dimmed. Their tools stopped changing. Their firelight grew scarce, and eventually their story was swallowed by the cold. Only we remained. And even we did not remain unchanged. Because the inheritance wasn't only genetic, it was conceptual. Interbreeding required proximity. But more than that, it required recognition. A kind of emotional bridge, a capacity to look into unfamiliar eyes and not see a stranger. That cognitive leap, to empathize across species lines, may have set the stage for other leaps, into art, into myth, into morality. To be human is not just to survive, it is to remember what survival cost. And somewhere in that memory, perhaps, is the echo of a Neanderthal mother, her child not returning, a Denisovan hunter watching strange tools appear, the slow, creeping awareness that something had shifted, that another mind had entered their world, adaptive, restless, strange, and that their own kind was becoming rare. They could not have known that their blood would live on, that fragments of them would be carried into satellites and cities and symphonies, that they would be dreamed of in museums and novels, that their bones would be cradled under glass by descendants of those who once stood beside them, and perhaps feared them, and perhaps loved them, and perhaps for a moment called them kin. What separates us from the ones who did not make it, not just biologically, but narratively? Because we are not just a species with memory, we are a species of memory. Our minds rehearse stories to make sense of what we've lost, and in the quiet presence of the Neanderthals and Denisovans, their fossils, their genomes, their mysteries, we are confronted with a story that refuses to be clean. They are not other, they are part of us. Their extinction is braided into our expansion. Their silence made space for our song, and that is not a triumph. It is a responsibility. To understand what remains of them, we must look within ourselves. Consider this. Some of the genes inherited from Neanderthals are linked to neurological wiring, to synapse formation, to how our brains develop in the womb. Others influence pain perception, circadian rhythms, even nicotine addiction. From Denisovans came adaptations for high altitude, essential to the survival of modern Tibetans. These are not cultural memories, but biological ones. Still, they shape us. They shape how we feel the world. But even beyond genetics, something more abstract may have come through. Cognitive modes, strategies, responses to stress and novelty, our capacity for symbolic language, our talent for layered communication. These things didn't erupt from a void. They were shaped by contact, pressure between minds. And pressure, as we've seen again and again in evolution, breeds innovation. Cognitive flexibility, especially in social environments, may have been our greatest gift. The ability to juggle multiple relationships, anticipate others' behaviour, infer intention. This suite of skills became crucial as group sizes expanded and alliances grew complex. Our ancestors built reputational scaffolds, gossip, ritual, story. These weren't distractions. They were survival strategies. In contrast, the Neanderthals, for all their strength and intelligence, may have lived in smaller, more isolated bands. This limited the spread of new ideas. Innovation could arise, but without enough social fabric to carry it, it faded. A new tool made in one valley might never reach the next. We built highways of culture. They built footpaths. And so, piece by piece, our ancestors wove a net wide enough to catch change or else and hold it. This too is intelligence. Not IQ, but interconnection. Not just brain size, but brain context. A mind alone can be brilliant. But a mind in a network becomes exponential. This is what allowed Homo sapiens to respond so swiftly to shifting climates, new predators, unfamiliar terrain. We did not have to reinvent the wheel in every generation. We could remember, not just through individuals, but through the group. And that memory, once externalized, became tradition, culture, identity. The Neanderthals and Denisovans may have had glimmers of this, but our version spread faster. It outpaced them, and with it came a kind of destiny. Not inevitable, but forceful. A wave of cognition that crested across continents, carrying with it both knowledge and forgetting. For in gaining the world, we lost something too. We lost the companionship of other intelligences. Close, hauntingly familiar, and now extinct. We lost alternative ways of being human. The Neanderthals may have dreamed differently, seen differently, spoken in timbres our ears no longer recognise. The Denisovans left behind almost nothing of their worldviews, their songs, their fears. What vanished was not merely their biology, but their perspective, a way of experiencing the earth that will never return. And that loss lingers in us, quietly, in museums, in bone fragments, in the mirrored alleles of our DNA, in the way we imagine monsters and gods that resemble us, but do not quite match. Echoes of the other that once walked beside us. We now live in a world of one surviving human species. A strange outcome when we remember that for most of our evolutionary story we were one branch among many. Dozens of hominins walked upright on this earth. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, each with its own trajectory, its own experiments in mind and form. That branching bush of possibility is now narrowed to a single line. Us. But in this narrowing, something expanded, because we carry their legacy, not as conquerors, but as mosaics. Pieces of them live in our blood, yes, but also in our fears of the dark, our hunger for companionship, our longing for something more than survival. These are not just the marks of our evolution. They are the fingerprints of our vanished siblings. So what made us different? It may be that we asked that question at all, that we turned our gaze inward, that we searched not only for food, but for meaning, that we did not just adapt to our world, we built maps of it, we made symbols of it, we remembered it, and memory in the end may be the fire that does not go out. Because as we sit by our own modern hearths, glowing screens, electric lights, we are still telling stories to one another, still gathering in circles to share warnings, to perform identity, to wonder aloud about our place in it all, still whispering about others, still haunted by absences. The Neanderthals are not here to speak for themselves, nor are the Denisovans. But in the silence they left behind, our imagination fills the gap. And imagination is one of our oldest tools. It builds bridges, it mourns what is gone, and it refuses to forget. In the long arc of human history, we did not rise alone. We rose in the company of others, cousins, shadows, mirrors, and what we do with that knowledge now is part of our unfinished story. To know who we are, we must remember who we walked beside. The others are gone. But their story is not over, because we are still here, and we are still listening. We are the only animal to imagine a harvest, before a seed has even touched the soil, before the stone walls rose, before the gates were locked at night, before grains swelled beneath the sun in domesticated rows. Something changed in the human mind, not just a change in action, but in anticipation. Our ancestors began to look at the chaos of seasons and hunger and see not fate, but pattern. They began to imagine futures. This was not merely a shift in how we lived. It was a neurological revolution. What happens to the brain when it begins to expect the world to obey? When food no longer comes unpredictably from the forest or savannah, but from careful planting, patient waiting, and deliberate control. The agricultural revolution, that vast transformation that tethered humanity to place and rhythm, reshaped the human experience, but it also restructured how we thought. To delay gratification is to time travel within the mind. To sacrifice the immediate for the future is to hold a model of that future, a cognitive architecture built on foresight, discipline, and memory. This was not how Homo sapiens had survived before. For nearly all of our history, we had been opportunists, moving with herds, foraging with what the earth gave us, tuned to the now. But farming required something radical: stability, trust in tomorrow, and the emotional regulation to endure scarcity without panic. Could that have been easy at first? Could we have truly understood the bargain? The soil would feed us, but it would also trap us. Sedentism, the act of staying, transformed not just landscapes but minds. Communities formed, not out of brief convergence like in nomadic bands, but through continuous contact. Relationships endured beyond seasons, roles became fixed, conflict became less avoidable. Property, once a foreign concept of fluid, roaming people, became rooted like the crops themselves. And the brain, that ancient pattern seeker, began to internalize this new world of permanence, where once it had mapped rivers and migrations, it now began to map debt, reputation, obligation. But perhaps the greatest transformation was not in how we thought about others, but in how we thought about time. A forager lives in a rhythm of presence, tracking, reacting, improvising. A farmer lives in cycles, sowing, tending, waiting. One is a dance with unpredictability, the other, an agreement with recurrence. Our brains had to learn patience. They had to learn faith in processes they could not see. And with that, faith came abstraction. To know that a seed in darkness would one day rise into nourishment required a symbolic leap, the very same kind of leap that underlies mathematics, ritual, religion. The field and the mind began to mirror one another, both furrowed, both cultivated, both storing potential in silence. What other forms of imagination were born in those furrows? What unseen structures began to take root in the human psyche once it believed that tomorrow could be planned? Among the earliest were systems of record, symbolic containers for memory that could endure beyond the fleeting recollection of individuals. In the mud and clay of ancient river valleys, humans began to scratch meaning into matter. Not for art, not for poetry, but for sheep, for wheat, for tribute. Before writing became literature, it was accounting. And before it became accounting, it was memory. Collective, externalized, and increasingly precise. This was a cognitive milestone. Until this point, everything a community knew had to live inside someone's head. Knowledge of seasons, healing, water sources, taboos. Stories passed from mouth to ear. But as agriculture grew, so too did the complexity of managing surplus. How much grain, stored where, owed to whom, for how long? The human brain, remarkable though it is, began to offload some of its burden into symbols. With each etched tablet and marked bone, we were not just documenting, we were augmenting. Out of this memory, scaffolding, emerged something radical: bureaucracy. An invisible web of roles and responsibilities, permissions and prohibitions. This web did not exist in nature. It was a fully abstract construction, as real in its consequences as any stone wall, yet composed of entirely imagined principles. And to function within it, the human brain had to become fluent in a new kind of thinking: system logic. Numbers became tools not just of counting, but of control. With them, you could plan the next harvest, calculate the ration for a family, estimate the labour for a temple wall. But you could also disguise, manipulate, and accumulate. Literacy, once it spread, stratified. Those who could read and write gained power over those who could not. Knowledge was no longer shared evenly around the fire. It could now be stored, hidden, centralized. Still, in the beginning, even this power felt sacred. The earliest writing was often inseparable from ritual. To inscribe was to fix something in time, to bind it, as one might bind a spell or a contract. And just as the earth was now expected to yield according to human timing, so too were relationships, debts, and deities. Systems of law emerged, codes etched in stone, proclaiming what was permitted, what was punished, what was divine. But to navigate such a world governed not by instinct but by doctrine, required yet another evolution of mind. No longer could emotion alone guide behaviour. One had to learn the rules, interpret the symbols, align action with a vision of order far larger than the individual. This was not natural selection in the wild. This was cognitive selection within civilization. The mind, once shaped by wind and hunger, was now being shaped by ink and number. And in that shaping, a new kind of intelligence was emerging, one that could model systems as complex as cities and still imagine gods above them. Because where bureaucracy counted sheep, belief counted meaning. Just as grain needed storage, the soul required explanation. And so another layer formed atop this growing lattice of human cognition. Religion, law, economy, vast intangible architectures held together not by stone or wood, but by consensus, by shared faith, by imagination made collective. These were not inventions of cold logic. They were deeply human responses to the strangeness of existence. Why do we suffer? Why does the river rise some years and fail in others? Why must a child die before the old? The same brain that calculated seed ratios also knelt in temples. The same hands that measured barley shaped idols of gods who blessed or cursed the harvest. The mind now operated across multiple scales: personal, social, cosmic. And to function in this new world, one needed to not only perceive patterns in nature, but believe in those beyond observation: justice, fate, property. None of these exist in the forest. They are stories we tell together, systems we enforce with shared conviction. Consider the invention of money. It is, at its core, a work of fiction, a symbol agreed upon by strangers that one object stands in for value: a shell, a stamped coin, a clay token. This required not just individual trust but systemic belief, that others also believed, that this piece of silver could feed you even if the farmer you trade it to had never met the blacksmith who minted it. This was abstraction at scale, and it required a brain capable of nesting those abstractions within daily life, of walking through a market and navigating dozens of silent contracts at once. Laws followed, and with them, justice systems, codified behaviours, written punishments, ideals of fairness. No longer could one rely solely on instinct or kinship to resolve conflict. Now there were judges, scribes, testimonies. The brain had to now consider precedent, motive, evidence, and above all, perspective. What would others see? What would they believe? Civilization demanded a new level of mental modelling, not just of the world, but of the minds of others. And yet for all this order, uncertainty did not vanish. It merely shifted. Where once the unknown lay in the hunt or storm, now it lived in the market, the court, the altar. And so, the mind, still deeply human, still wired for narrative, filled in the gaps. We told stories of origin, of destiny. We created pantheons and heavens, omens and prophecies, all to make sense of this vast invented world. In doing so, we built cities not just on land but in thought. Cities of custom, cities of metaphor, cities of belief. Invisible yet enduring, they shaped us as surely as any wall or road, and their foundations were laid not in stone, but in minds. As these mental architectures matured, the human brain became not just an engine of survival, but of negotiation, with rules, with values, with futures imagined but not yet lived. In these dense webs of abstraction, the capacity to simulate outcomes, weigh consequences and delay gratification became critical. Every field planted was a wager against time. Every social promise, from a marriage to a debt, was a fragile bridge between intention and memory. The brain, it seems, had begun not only to think, but to plan within systems. It could simulate what the law might decide, how the gods might respond, how neighbours might react. And in doing so, it began to form complex inner models of entire worlds. Cities that lived within the skull, composed of hierarchies, trade routes, festivals, rituals, and fears. These simulations were invisible, but they governed action with remarkable precision. At this scale of thinking, self-control became a survival trait. Impulse was no longer an advantage. The farmer who resisted eating his stored grain in lean times had better odds of long-term survival than the one who indulged. The merchant who could hold his tongue during negotiation might gain more than the one who gave in to pride. The scribe who memorized protocol earned a place in palace administration. Slowly, across generations, neural wiring favored patience, strategy, social fluency. In this way, civilizations subtly selected for minds that could navigate complexity. This complexity was not merely technical. It was emotional, moral, and philosophical. Cities brought people into relentless contact, not only with kin, but with strangers, with foreigners, with competitors. Suddenly, individuals had to hold multiple truths at once: loyalty to family, obedience to law, reverence to deity, all while managing envy, suspicion, desire. It was not enough to be clever. One had to be coherent, able to balance the competing demands of internal life and external expectation. This internal balancing act may be the root of something deeper, the sense of self, the reflective narrator inside our heads, the one who rehearses conversations, replays mistakes, negotiates what kind of person we ought to be. In the jungle, such reflection may be a luxury. In a city, it is a necessity. Because in a city, you're not just surviving, you are performing. Identity became curated. Public and private selves diverged. Masks emerged, not out of deception, but adaptation. The self that trades in the market is not the same as the self that weeps in prayer. The brain began to juggle roles, to track context, to adjust tone. This was not duplicity. It was complexity, the mind bending itself to meet the manifold demands of social life. In this way, the ancient scaffolding of memory and ritual evolved into something more fluid. Personality, a city of selves within a self. And as these inner cities expanded, so too did the distance between instinct and action. We were becoming not just human, but deeply, knowingly human. And yet, with all this growth, a paradox arose. For all the mental expansion civilization demanded, it also began to constrain. The very systems that enriched the mind also boxed it in. The rhythms of the earth, once intimately known, became abstracted through calendar and clock. The stories of elders gave way to state-approved histories. The wild unpredictability of nature, once a crucible of adaptation, was tamed behind irrigation canals and stone walls. Still, the brain adapted. It learned to find novelty within pattern, to seek freedom within structure. It played games, composed hymns, invented myths. It dreamed within the latticework of civilization, and in doing so, pushed against its boundaries. This tension between order and imagination, between system and soul, may be the defining characteristic of urban cognition. Cities offered safety, but they also demanded conformity, and the mind, always restless, found ways to subvert, to reinterpret, to create. New languages emerged from old tongues, new gods from ancient ones. Revolutions brewed not just in politics, but in thought. Even the earliest cities show evidence of this duality. Alongside warehouses and walls we find shrines. Amid tablets of grain accounts we find poetry. Amid tools of measurement we find figurines of gods, of women, of dreams. The city was never just a mechanism. It was a canvas, and the brain, shaped by its pressures, became both engineer and artist. Because to thrive in such environments required more than intelligence. It required flexibility, the ability to shift between roles, to learn new customs, to model the minds of many others. It was not enough to simply know. One had to interpret, to symbolize, to mean. The mind evolved not only to process the world, but to reflect it, to reimagine it, to remake it. And perhaps this is the great turning point. For millions of years, intelligence had served survival. It hunted, gathered, mapped, escaped. But now it also composed, it legislated, it dreamed forward. The brain was no longer merely reactive, it became projective, capable of envisioning not just the next step but entire futures. Not just what is, but what could be. It is here, in these invisible cities of thought, that the roots of philosophy, of ethics, of art truly take hold. The idea that we could question our own nature, ponder justice, wonder at the stars, not to survive, but to understand. This was a new kind of cognition, one shaped not by tooth and claw, but by temple and tally, by silence in the library, by argument in the square, by the flicker of candlelight on ink-stained parchment. And so, from fields of wheat and walls of stone, a new landscape emerged, one not of matter, but of mind. The city had entered us, and we, in turn, had become its architects, of culture, of identity, of the stories we would tell for generations to come. It began with a whisper, a neuron flickering in the dark, a pathway opening where none had been, one spark, then another, until thought itself became wildfire. And now, 2 million years later, that same cascade of synapses has remade the skin of the earth. Oceans acidify beneath the weight of industry. Forests fall like memories forgotten. Species vanish before we even name them. All of it, reshaped by a creature that once huddled in caves, afraid of the storm. We are that creature. We are that storm. How does a brain, evolved for survival on the savannah, end up building machines that circle the stars? How does a mind shaped by the hunt come to split atoms or code dreams into silicon? The answer lies not in a singular leap, but in a runaway loop. Intelligence feeding on itself, building scaffold after scaffold of abstraction, until the architecture of thought stretches far beyond its evolutionary blueprint. Like fire once tamed to roast roots, now burning across entire continents, our cognition escaped the constraints of context. It scaled. But with scale came dissonance. For every invention that saved a life, another distanced us from the living world. Agriculture fed multitudes, but fractured our relationship with the land. Cities offered safety, but severed us from night skies and animal kin. The more powerful the brain became, the more it transformed its environment, and the more alien that environment became to the instincts that built us. We optimized for efficiency. We forgot to ask, for whom? This is the paradox of Homo sapiens, that the very traits which once ensured our survival now push us toward the edge. Intelligence, so long the answer, has become the question. What happens when an organ outpaces its own equilibrium? When memory exceeds the body? When awareness becomes burden? The mind, once a candle against the dark, now burns with the intensity of a sun. And like the sun, it scorches as well as warms. The Anthropocene is not a geological era. It is a neurological event. It is what happens when a brain, evolved to predict the behaviour of lions and rivers and seasonal winds, suddenly finds itself tasked with managing nuclear chains and global supply networks and algorithmic futures. We are not maladapted, we are over-adapted. We are minds running beyond their bodies, thoughts without edges, consequences without instinct. And yet, what if this was inevitable, not a mistake, but an acceleration, a runaway cascade in the great experiment of life? Intelligence, once set in motion, rarely slows. Just as oxygen once poisoned the planet before becoming its breath, could our overthinking serve some future function we can't yet imagine? Or is this, perhaps, the cost of insight? That to know is also to unmake. The Earth has been changed before. Volcanoes have darkened the skies. Comets have ended dynasties of lizards. But never before has a single species rewritten the rules of its own niche. Never before has an animal become the environment. What happens when you become the storm you once feared? And if you are the storm, can you choose not to rage? That may be the final question our brains ask of themselves. Because while our ancestors sharpened flint, we now sharpen algorithms, systems that learn faster than we can, predicting what we want before we know it ourselves. Our tools have grown teeth. They no longer simply extend our hands, they mimic our minds. And in that mimicry, they also reshape them. Consider the smartphone, not just a device, but an appendage, a prosthetic cortex. Within it lives our calendars, our maps, our photographs, our memories. It whispers reminders, sings lullabies, connects us across oceans. But in doing so, it takes something as well: attention, presence, stillness. A brain that evolved to scan the savannah now pings and scrolls through 1,000 micro-realities per day. We are always elsewhere. We are always on. This is not merely distraction. It is dislocation. The modern mind floats in an information sea, but no longer remembers how to swim by feel. Once, to learn was to embody, to walk the land, hear the stories, mimic the elder. Now it is to search, to skim, to forget. Our external brains, books, servers, clouds, have grown so vast that we no longer need to carry the weight of memory ourselves. But in laying that burden down, we may also have laid down some part of what made us whole. Technology is not evil, it is extension, it is echo. Fire did not intend to burn villages, it simply burned. But intent matters less than outcome when feedback loops are this fast. We've built systems that reward novelty over nuance, reaction over reflection. They show us not the world, but the version of it that captures our gaze, and the brain, ever curious, chases the glittering threads. This creates a strange feedback, a loop between brain and machine, each shaping the other. Our algorithms learn from our impulses. We, in turn, become more impulsive under their gaze. The architectures of digital life begin to mirror our oldest instincts: tribalism, rivalry, status. But in amplifying these, they also trap us in echo chambers of anxiety and disconnection. We crave connection and find comparison. We seek meaning and find noise. And in this overstimulated world, a quiet tragedy unfolds. The mind, once so alive to nuance, to the hush of dusk, to the slow story of a seed becoming root, now flickers from screen to screen, from panic to meme. Stress becomes background radiation. Sleep thins. Focus shatters, loneliness deepens. We have built the most connected civilization in history, and yet isolation stalks us like a shadow. What, then, is the cost of consciousness amplified? What do we lose when every tool we make reflects not our aspirations, but our appetites? We do not face a failure of intelligence. We face an excess of it, unbounded, unguided, always accelerating. And still the brain hums onward, endlessly adaptive, endlessly awake, but beginning perhaps to wonder what it's racing toward. Because as the external world bends under the weight of our cognition, the internal world buckles too. The mind, once calibrated to the rhythms of day and season, is now asked to process more stimuli in a morning than a hunter-gatherer might in a month. Advertisements, headlines, messages, alerts, fragments of meaning, each demanding attention, none offering rest. The brain is not overwhelmed because it is weak. It is overwhelmed because it is ancient. What began as a tool for tracking predators and social alliances has now been conscripted into the management of a 24-hour digital economy. We are expected to multitask, to optimize, to perform. But the neural wiring that evolved under trees and stars was never meant to bear this velocity. It adapted to stories whispered around fires, not the roar of infinite scroll. In this environment, the self fragments. Anxiety, once a useful tool for survival, becomes constant background noise. Depression, a form of withdrawal once linked to conserving energy and scarcity, now lingers amid abundance, attention splinters, memory frays, and beneath it all, a dull ache. The sense that something vital has been misplaced, not lost, not destroyed, but simply obscured. This is not romantic nostalgia. It is biological dissonance. The body evolved to move, to touch, to pause, to breathe in rhythm with living things. Now it sits still, hunched, blue-lit, entranced by simulations. The village has gone global, but the nervous system still belongs to the savannah, and this mismatch, this widening gap between instinct and environment, is perhaps the most profound trial our species has ever faced. We once feared the wild, now we fear the quiet. We once stared into the unknown sky and saw gods. Now we stare into glass rectangles hoping for meaning. The brain, ever resilient, has adjusted. But at what cost? For in filtering so much, we may also filter too finely. Serendipity disappears, depth becomes rare. And wonder, that most ancient signal of learning, flickers in and out like a weak connection. There is irony here. The brain that evolved to understand others, to feel, to intuit, to create, now finds itself isolated even in crowds. We designed tools to bring us closer, but proximity is not intimacy. Data is not empathy. And in our effort to know everything, we risk knowing no one fully, not even ourselves. Yet perhaps this is not an end, but a turning. Every evolutionary leap brings disorientation. Every age of transformation feels like a crisis while it's lived. What we feel now, the overstimulation, the anxiety, the sense of unravelling, may be less a collapse and more a chrysalis. The brain is changing. The species is changing. And as in all metamorphosis, there is confusion before clarity. But what if we remembered how to listen? Not to the noise, but to the silence beneath it. Because under the static, the brain is still listening, still dreaming, still reaching toward balance. For even as we scatter ourselves across digital planes, even as the pace of life races beyond comprehension, the ancient rhythms persist somewhere within us. The breath still slows at dusk, the heartbeat still responds to birdsong, the skin still softens in the presence of another's warmth. Evolution is not undone so easily, and in that there is hope. The same brain that built cities and satellites also painted on cave walls and rocked infants to sleep. It is not only a builder, it is a keeper of memory, a weaver of meaning, and while overstimulation clouds the surface, deeper currents endure. We are still the descendants of those who gathered in circles and sang, who looked at fire not only as warmth, but as mystery, who grieved their dead and marked the stone with pigment. This capacity for inner life, for stillness, for awe, has not vanished. It has simply been buried beneath speed, and sometimes it stirs in quiet moments, when we watch the sun rise over a quiet lake, or hear a child's laughter echo across a room. Then the ancient mind looks up and remembers itself, but it remembers too that the world it shaped is now shaping it back. Climate shifts, species vanish, the forests grow silent, the oceans warm. Our runaway cognition, so clever and so restless, has set in motion forces that the old mind never knew. And now it is being asked to reconcile its gifts with its consequences, to wield empathy not just for kin but for planet, to extend foresight beyond quarterly returns, to feel responsibility not only for the tribe but for the tree, the river, the unseen. This is the strange turn we now face. Our intelligence, which once served survival, must now serve restraint. Our imagination, which once dreamed gods, must now envision systems, more sustainable, more just. The brain that once grew to navigate danger must now learn how not to create it. This is not merely ethical, It is neurological, because overstimulation is not just a cultural artifact, it is a physiological mismatch. We cannot outrun, outscroll, or outhack our wiring, but we can listen to it, honour it, learn from it. The ancient pathways of rest, of presence, of focused attention, these are not indulgences. They are necessities, not regressions, but recalibrations. And as our tools evolve, as artificial intelligence rises and automation deepens, the pressure on our biological minds will only increase. We must decide, will we bend entirely to the machine's tempo, or will we remember the slower, richer pulse beneath? Perhaps the most radical act of intelligence now is to pause, because in the pause, the brain finds something it can no longer gather from information alone: integration, meaning, coherence. And with coherence comes care, for ourselves, for each other, and for the fragile web of life that once raised us from the plains. To pause is not to regress, it is to remember. It is to realign a magnificent overclocked mind with the deeper rhythms of its origin. For when we strip away the noise, we are still the creatures of firelight, still storytellers, still meaning makers. We are still wired for ritual, for gesture, for slow and sacred time. We do not need to abandon modernity to reclaim the ancient mind. We need only to design with it in mind, to build systems that nourish, not exploit, to value presence over performance, to treat attention not as a resource to be mined, but a garden to be tended. The brain is not a machine, it is a living history, a layered archive of 200,000 years of adaptation, intuition, and dream. And though it has carried us to astonishing heights, it now stands at a threshold it never anticipated. The intelligence that once kept us alive now risks remaking the planet in ways that make life harder for all. Yet even this is not the end of the story, because awareness changes the arc, and the mind, this restless luminous organ, is not only capable of destruction, it is capable of reflection, of reinvention, of healing. Imagine a world designed not for maximal efficiency, but for deep resonance. A world where education honours curiosity over compliance, where technology slows us down instead of speeding us up, where public space invites contemplation, where rest is not a reward, but a right. These are not fantasies. They are blueprints waiting to be drawn by minds that remember what they are truly for. And perhaps this is the paradox we must accept, that our greatest evolutionary achievement, this vast, stormlit brain, is also our greatest vulnerability, that the power to alter the earth must now be matched by the wisdom to preserve it. That insight, not instinct, must guide the next age. In this light, we are not the apex of intelligence, we are its stewards, and if we can hold that stewardship with care, if we can slow down, tune in, choose wisely, then perhaps the brain will not have eaten the world after all. Perhaps it will finally learn how to listen to it. What happens when the most powerful organ in the known universe turns its gaze inward? For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain has been shaped by its battles with the outside world, through hunger and hardship, fire and frost, love and loss. But now, in an age when external survival is often secured, a quieter revolution stirs, one not of tools or fire, but of stillness, of breath, of awareness. The same mind that once crafted spears from stone and stories from stars now asks itself a different kind of question. Who am I, beneath the noise? The science of mindfulness has begun to trace the ancient neural trails carved by attention. In monasteries, in hospitals, in laboratories glowing with quiet machines, researchers and seekers alike are discovering something astonishing, that the act of observing one's thoughts can reshape the brain itself. Neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to rewire and adapt, is no longer just a relic of childhood, but a companion to every moment of consciousness. Every breath taken in deliberate focus thickens the prefrontal cortex, calms the amygdala, and smooths the waves of anxiety that too often crash against the shores of the modern mind. How strange that stillness, so often mistaken for weakness, is revealed to be one of the most powerful forces of internal transformation. In ancient India, China, and Egypt, the cultivation of attention was already seen as a form of mastery, a way not only to understand the world, but to tame it from within. These early traditions sensed what modern science now confirms, that attention is a lever and the mind is a landscape that can be reshaped. But why would such a capacity evolve at all? What use does nature have for a brain that can observe itself? The answer may lie not in solitude but in society, for our minds are not solitary chambers, they are permeable, entangled webs, constantly reading and being read by the emotions of others. Mirror neurons, those silent mimics buried deep in our motor cortex, light up not only when we act, but when we see others act. Empathy is not just a moral stance, it is a neurological imperative. To survive in the groups our ancestors depended on, we had to know what others felt before they said a word. And yet in today's world the signals are tangled. The mind swims through a torrent of stimuli, alerts, images, comparisons, many of them designed not to inform but to provoke. In such conditions, attention becomes a battlefield, and mindfulness is no longer a luxury but a resistance. What happens when the same brain that once deciphered the tracks of an antelope must now decode the shadows of its own fears, its own digital reflections, its own restlessness? What kind of mind thrives not in chaos but in clarity? What kind of future can be shaped by a mind that chooses what to notice? One possibility is a future shaped not by isolated intelligence, but by collective awareness, the merging of many minds into a network of insight, cooperation, and shared memory. Human brains have always existed in relationship, never in isolation. Even the earliest hominins relied on collective knowledge to survive. What to eat, where to travel, when to rest. But something shifted as language became more intricate, as rituals emerged, as cultural transmission took on momentum. Memory itself was no longer just personal, it was pooled. And now, in the modern world, our social brains have scaled beyond what evolution ever anticipated. We live embedded in vast webs of information and communication, where a single insight can echo across continents in seconds. Yet this networked mind comes with new risks: groupthink, polarization, virality without verification. The same circuits that once helped a tribe read each other's emotions now strain to process the cascade of headlines, comments, and curated selves. Still, the promise remains. In small groups, something extraordinary happens. Dialogue, real, open dialogue, begins to resemble a kind of shared cognition. Ideas evolve between people. Emotions regulate across faces. Insight flickers not within one skull, but between many. From therapy circles to research labs, from indigenous councils to open-source code communities, the human mind becomes something more than itself, an emergent intelligence that remembers, adapts, and heals through relationship. It isn't a poetic metaphor. It's a measurable phenomenon. Studies in social neuroscience have shown that people engaged in cooperative tasks exhibit synchronized brain activity, as if their minds begin to harmonize. Empathy and compassion aren't just sentiments. They are patterns. They can be practiced, grown, cultivated like a garden. But gardens need tending, and in a world flooded with distraction, the most radical collective act may be not to speak louder, but to listen more deeply, not to accumulate more opinions, but to ask better questions. The return to the self is not a retreat from society, but a return to the roots of connection, presence, attention, and the ability to truly see one another. The future of our species may depend less on raw intelligence and more on shared insight, on minds that can not only learn together, but change together. As individuals, we can harness neuroplasticity to reshape our habits and heal from trauma. But as groups, we may tap into something even greater, the kind of adaptive intelligence that doesn't just solve problems, but dissolves the illusions that created them in the first place. And this brings us to a question more urgent than ever. How far can the brain stretch? Because in the era we now inhabit, the mind faces choices it never evolved to confront: artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, genetic augmentation. These aren't the dreams of science fiction anymore. They are prototypes, and they lead us to a crossroads where evolution is no longer only biological. It becomes deliberate. For the first time in the history of the life on Earth, a species stands on the edge of designing its own cognitive future, no longer bound by the slow rhythms of genetic inheritance, We now engineer tools that not only amplify thought, but may one day merge with it. Brain-machine interfaces already allow signals to leap from mind to machine, allowing paralyzed individuals to move robotic limbs, or even type with thought alone. Augmented reality, neural implants, and AI companions hint at a coming convergence. Our minds, increasingly extended beyond the skull, entangled with systems that never sleep. But what does it mean to be human when memory can be outsourced and attention can be bought? Some argue that this is the natural continuation of a process that began with the first fire, the first story, the first tool. After all, a smartphone is just a more complex version of a stick used to poke a termite mound. Yet there is something qualitatively different when our tools begin to predict us, imitate us, and perhaps one day surpass us. Intelligence, once the rarest evolutionary treasure, is now being distilled into circuits that don't eat, don't forget, and don't sleep. Does this make us obsolete, or more essential than ever? Perhaps the true power of the human brain is not in what it can calculate, but in what it can contemplate. Not in the speed of its processing, but in the depth of its reflection. Machines may write symphonies, but only a mind scarred by longing can write a lullaby that soothes a child. Only a consciousness shaped by loss can grasp the quiet ache of memory. This too is intelligence, and it is not easily coded. As the frontiers of augmentation stretch before us, we must ask not only what kind of minds we can build, but what kind of minds we wish to become. Neuroplasticity is our birthright, but also our responsibility. What we practice, we become. If we practice distraction, our brains will be scattered. If we practice violence, our thoughts will sharpen into weapons. But if we practice compassion, presence, patience, even amid complexity, then our minds may evolve not just in power, but in wisdom. And perhaps this is what has always distinguished our species. Not our strength, nor even our cleverness, but our ability to become what we imagine. The Homo sapiens brain is not fixed. It is a shapeshifter, a mirror that molds to the hand that holds it. In meditation halls, classrooms, prisons and playrooms, the mind is being sculpted, not by chance, but by choice. And as we gaze into the future, the real question is not how smart we will become, but how kind, how curious, how awake. Because the next stage of human evolution will not be in the hands of natural selection. It will unfold in the space between stimulus and response, in the quiet, powerful moment where we decide how to see. This moment, the pause, is where transformation happens. Not through force, nor even through genius, but through awareness. That gap, brief and invisible, holds the potential for everything. Forgiveness instead of fury, wonder instead of boredom, attention instead of automation. It is where the ancient brain, evolved in the savannahs and shadows of deep time, meets the modern world and asks, now what? Neuroplasticity gives us this freedom. Unlike most animals, we're not simply born with a fixed set of instincts. We are born incomplete, vulnerable, dependent, and unfinished. It's a precarious beginning, but also a profound opportunity. The brain builds itself as we move through the world, and it never stops. A child learning to read, an elder learning to dance, a person healing from trauma, all are sculpting the very architecture of their perception. Even the act of watching this story, this meditation on the mind's journey, is part of that shaping. The images we dwell on, the ideas we carry, the rhythms we let into our consciousness, they all leave traces. Neurons fire, connect, strengthen. And over time, identity emerges not as a fixed essence, but as a river, shaped by tributaries of memory, flowing across the landscape of culture, season, and attention. This is why introspection is not indulgence, it is navigation. As ancient as our tools may be, no compass has more bearing than the ability to turn inward and ask, what is this moment asking of me? In some cultures, this act of inner inquiry was formalized into meditation traditions. In others, it emerged through storytelling, solitude, or ritual. But across time and place, humans have always returned to themselves, not as an escape from the world, but as a way to meet it more fully. Even now, as algorithms tug at our attention, and headlines churn like storm clouds, the path inward remains. Brain scans of meditators show not only temporary calm, but structural changes in areas related to attention, emotion regulation, and compassion. And what's more, these changes ripple outward. People who cultivate mindfulness often report not just personal clarity, but deeper patience with others and greater resilience in the face of uncertainty. This is the paradox of the self-reflective brain. The more clearly we see ourselves, the more we connect with others. Introspection is not isolation. It is the birthplace of empathy, and so, the return to the self is also the return to the world. With clearer eyes, softer breath, a steadier gaze. The human mind, after all, is not a closed loop. It is a membrane, porous to love, tuned to stories, always reaching toward what it does not yet understand. We are not just observers of the universe, we are participants in its unfolding. And what unfolds next may depend on a question older than speech: how will we choose to be? This is where the journey brings us, not to a destination, but to a threshold. At the beginning of this story, we asked why humans developed massive brains. What strange evolutionary gamble led to this oversized, energy-hungry organ lodged behind our eyes? An organ capable of fear, poetry, cruelty, forgiveness, and flight. We have walked through the Rift Valley, sat beside ancient hearths, shared dreams in the flickering dark of painted caves, and traced the ever-widening web of language, culture, and imagination. We now see that the brain did not grow in isolation. It grew in relationship, with environment, with community, with time itself. And in doing so, it created a paradox. The more powerful our minds became, the more fragile they felt. Because with every new layer of cognition came new awareness, of death, of choice, of consequence. We are not just problem solvers. We are meaning makers, and meaning, unlike memory, cannot be stored on a hard drive. It must be lived, felt, repeated in ritual, reflected in the eyes of another, whispered across generations. The most powerful software our brains have ever run is not technological. It is ethical. It is the question of how to live with each other, with the planet, and with ourselves. In this light, the return to the self is not a retreat from evolution, but a continuation of it, a turning point. Intelligence has brought us to the edge of climate collapse, genetic engineering, and artificial minds. But it may also bring us into a new kind of stewardship, not only of ecosystems and data, but of awareness itself. We often imagine evolution as a climb, but it may also be a spiral. Each revolution brings us back to something ancient, seen anew. The breath, the body, the choice to pause, to listen. Even as technology surrounds us, the most revolutionary act may be the simplest one: to notice, to bring attention not to what is loudest, but to what is most alive. A child's question, a falling leaf, a stranger's kindness. In those moments, the brain's full architecture hums with resonance, neural networks shaped by eons of adaptation now pulsing with something that has no name, but every culture has known: presence. And perhaps that is where the story ends, or begins again. Because the human brain is not just a record of what has happened, it is a rehearsal for what could be. In the quiet of meditation, in the pulse of shared music, in the pause before reaction, we glimpse the next frontier of consciousness. Not bigger, not faster, but deeper. The same brain that hunted mammoths now plants seeds of compassion. The same mind that once feared the dark now closes its eyes to seek the light within. This is not the end of evolution. It is its next invitation. At the edge of all knowing, past the fields of science and the forests of memory, the dreaming animal lingers, not defined by the size of its tools, nor the speed of its conquest, but by something quieter, the flicker of wonder behind the eyes. For all the complexity of the human brain, all the billions of neurons and synaptic firestorms, there remains a mystery it cannot solve from the outside. The place where thought ends and awe begins. Why do we dream in colour when the world offers only data? Why do we cry at music or carve stories into stone walls, or pause beneath stars that no longer burn? What force inside us yearns not merely to live, but to mean? It is this yearning, strange, impractical, persistent, that separates us not by intelligence, but by interiority. The lion hunts, the ape strategizes, but only the human gazes into a fire and sees myth. We are evolution's eccentric child, a species whose mind grew so large it broke free from survival alone. The mind that once modelled the path of prey now models eternity. The hands that once shaped flint now shape memory. We tell ourselves stories not just to teach, but to remember, to mourn, to wonder. In the ruins of Göbekli Tepe and the ochre streaks of Chauvet, something speaks not of utility but of longing. Who were they painting for? What gods did they seek? Across continents and millennia, humans have dreamt the same dreams, of ascents into the sky, of beasts half seen, of lost mothers and distant lights. These are not evolutionary necessities, they are evolutionary gifts. But why? What did the dreaming mind offer that the calculating mind could not? Perhaps it was precisely this, the ability to imagine, that made us adaptable not just to the world that was, but to the world that could be. To grieve before the body is gone, to hope before the harvest arrives, to build cathedrals not because we must, but because we can. Or then maybe the software of survival, and beauty, impractical, defiant beauty, might be its silent engine. Yet awe is not always loud, often it whispers, in the rhythm of a drum that echoes across savannahs, in the quiet grief of a burial no one will ever witness, in the handprint left on a cave wall, declaring nothing but, "I was here." It is in this space, the space between the breath and the word, that humanity first became something more than clever, something sacred. For the dreaming animal does not just change the world, it listens to it, it kneels before it, it dares to believe that behind all this machinery there is still magic. What happens to a species when it begins to dream of things it cannot touch? What happens when imagination outruns evolution, when myth becomes more powerful than muscle? What happens when a mind, designed to survive, begins to wonder what it means to be alive? It begins to tell stories, not just to others, but to itself, because to dream is to remember forward. And in those stories, of origin, of love, of death, of stars, the dreaming animal finds something far older than knowledge: continuity. This is the storyteller's brain, sculpted not just by memory but by metaphor, a brain that can bind time, collapse distance, and awaken sympathy for people who never existed. Long before alphabets and archives, story was our first technology, not of tools but of minds. It taught us who we were, and more importantly who we could be. Around communal fires our ancestors reimagined the hunt as legend, the sky as home for gods, the river as a vein of spirit. These were not delusions, they were rehearsals, exercises in empathy, abstraction, and cohesion. If survival required cooperation, story gave us reason to stay close. If a world of predators and droughts demanded resilience, story gave us faith. These early tales were not entertainment but infrastructure. They taught children how to read the seasons, how to grieve, how to forgive. They offered maps, not of geography but of meaning. Neuroscience has begun to map this terrain too. MRI scans light up our brains differently when we read fiction versus facts. Fiction, it turns out, activates the same neural pathways we use to navigate real relationships. To imagine is to simulate. To imagine another's sorrow is, in a small way, to carry it. This makes stories one of the oldest empathy engines we know, and in the crucible of evolutionary stress, ice ages, migrations, rival clans, the ability to simulate, persuade, and unify may have been more vital than brawn. But stories did more than unify. They allowed contradiction. In story, a being can be both trickster and teacher, hero and fool. This flexibility mirrors the flexibility of the brain itself, that glorious, frustrating capacity for nuance, irony, and metaphor. The dreaming animal does not just create symbols, it lives through them. A storm becomes anger, a mountain becomes eternity, a parent becomes the moon. In this symbolic layering we find a kind of neural alchemy. turning the chaos of existence into something with shape, rhythm, and echo. And through this alchemy, humanity forged culture. Story became myth, myth became ritual, ritual became civilization. From cave wall to sacred text to digital screen, the arc remains the same, a mind reaching beyond its moment, a pattern woven from pain and hope, a child sitting beside an elder, listening to the old tales, and beneath it all, the same flicker in the eyes, wonder. In this light, the storyteller's brain is not a byproduct of evolution. It is its culmination, the ultimate adaptation, not to the earth beneath our feet, but to the mystery behind our eyes, a mind that dreams and in dreaming endures. But what does it dream of now? What becomes of the dreaming animal in a world of satellites and silicon, where stories are streamed and meaning is commodified? We live in a time of immense knowledge, more data than any tribe could imagine, more access than any oracle could offer, and yet we are still dreaming, still telling tales in dark rooms, still searching for patterns in the noise. This tells us something crucial. The function of thought is not merely comprehension, it is connection, and that connection, increasingly, is not limited to the individual. Brains today are embedded, not just in heads, but in networks. What one mind forgets, the internet remembers. What one person imagines, another can render. We are building a collective memory, a distributed cognition. From oral tradition to cloud storage, the journey of thought has always been toward extension. And yet, even as we merge with our machines, a question flickers at the edge of consciousness. Is this evolution or escape? The answer may depend on what we carry forward, not just technologically but emotionally. Because amidst this externalization of mind, the dreaming animal is still present, still fragile, still searching for silence, for meaning, for wonder. In neuroscience, we now speak of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reshape itself, a kind of internal evolution, responding not over millennia, but in months. Through meditation, therapy, learning, and attention, we alter the architecture of our own minds. This too is story, not of a tribe or a god, but of the self. The ancient myths told of transformation, frogs into princes, spirits into storms, and perhaps they were always metaphors for what the brain can do. To change not just what we know, but how we know. To watch our own thoughts with the same curiosity we once reserved for the heavens. This introspective turn is not new. It echoes the teachings of sages and mystics, monks and philosophers, who sat with their breath and dared to witness the mind without judgment. Science now affirms what these traditions intuited, that attention is power, that breath calms not just the body, but the storm of thought, that we are not merely passengers of the brain's busyness, we are gardeners of it. To dream well, we must tend the soil, and in this tending, in this quiet return to the self, the mind becomes once again what it has always been, a mirror, a map, a flame. But the dreaming animal no longer dreams alone. It dreams with machines, with satellites, with simulations. This is not unnatural. It is the latest layer of thought. The question is not whether we will change, but what we will become, and whether in the vast data fields of the future we will still pause to gaze at the stars and wonder what they mean, whether amidst the noise we will still tell stories, not because we must, but because we care, because caring, not calculating, is what has always made our minds distinct. Evolution sculpted intelligence, but emotion gave it purpose. A brain that can map the stars is powerful. A brain that weeps at their beauty is human. Awe, grief, joy, longing. These are not errors in the system. They are the signal itself. And in a world increasingly shaped by logic and efficiency, the dreaming animal reminds us that it is not knowledge that makes us wise, but feeling. This is where evolutionary models begin to falter. Natural selection explains function. It tells us why eyes evolved, why hands grasp, why brains grew. But it does not easily explain why music moves us to tears, or why a child draws a spiral on stone, or why a people sing to the ocean. These acts carry no immediate survival advantage. They are not calculations of gain. They are expressions of something deeper, the yearning to belong, to time, to each other, to something larger than flesh and fate. Anthropologists have long noted the ubiquity of symbolic behaviour across early human cultures. From ochre-stained shells to carved figurines, from rhythmic dances to whispered prayers, we see evidence not only of intelligence, but of longing. A mind that seeks not only shelter, but significance. In this light, evolution did not just select for strength or skill, it selected for wonder, for the ability to be moved, and perhaps, in a paradox as old as fire, this vulnerability is our greatest strength. The capacity to feel deeply, to mourn, to celebrate, to imagine, is not a weakness of the human mind. It is its crowning feature. Empires rise and fall, technologies evolve, but the child sitting beneath a tree dreaming of gods and monsters remains unchanged. It is in that dreaming that civilization begins. And now, at the end of this journey, through neurons and migrations, rituals and revolutions, we return to that child, to the quiet pulse behind the eyes, to the creature who once looked at a flickering fire and saw not just heat, but meaning. This is what the brain was always for, not conquest, not control, but communion. So what, then, is the future of thought? It will be faster, certainly, wider, perhaps even immortal, stored in machines or echoed in code. But the question is not how much we will know, it is how deeply we will feel. Whether the dreaming animal, in its new temples of silicon and light, will still pause to whisper its myths. Whether, in building a world, we remember why we built it at all. Because in the end, the mind is not a machine, it is a mystery. And the most human act is not invention, it is reverence. It is the courage to look inward and still be amazed. And so, the dreaming animal sits, not as conqueror of the earth, but as witness to it. After all the migrations, the inventions, the wars, the poems, the algorithms, what remains is a pulse of consciousness that still yearns to understand not just the world, but its place within it. The mind, this improbable flame flickering inside fragile bone, has carried us through ice ages and deserts, across oceans and centuries. And now, with that same ancient fire, it turns toward the horizon of what comes next. But perhaps the most vital frontier is not out there, but here, in our ability to ask new kinds of questions. Not just what can I know, but what is worth knowing. Not just what can I build, but what should I become. These are questions of care, of conscience, and they belong not to machines but to minds, to human minds, dreaming minds. As we move forward, guided by neural networks and augmented realities, the future will not be written only in code, but in story. For story is how the mind understands time, consequence, hope. It is how a memory becomes a meaning, how a signal becomes a soul. From cave walls to cinema screens, from myths to simulations, we shape ourselves through the narratives we choose to carry. And this is the closing note of our journey. That the vast brain of Homo sapiens, grown in hunger and fear and firelight, finds its greatest purpose not in domination, but in reflection. Not in answers, but in wonder. The dreaming animal has always been a storyteller, and now it has more stories than ever. But perhaps the most important story is the one it tells about itself. You are that animal. You are that mind. You carry within you the echoes of 1,000 lives, the laughter of ancestors around a fire, the first handprint on stone, the silent gaze that watched the stars and wondered if they were alive. Every time you pause to dream, to remember, to care, you rejoin that ancient lineage, not with tools or weapons, but with presence, with the decision to stay open, to feel. This is what the large brain gave us, not certainty, but the capacity for awe, not perfection, but possibility. And so, as this story closes, let us return not to the beginning, but to the breath, to the quiet presence of the self, a flicker of thought, alive in time, a creature of matter, lit by meaning. In the end, we are not just the species that thinks, we are the species that dreams, and from those dreams, we make a world. Thank you, fellow sapien, for walking with us along this long arc of becoming, a journey through neurons and firelight, migrations and memories, all the way to the quiet places where stories dream us back into ourselves. If this story gave you a moment of stillness, or a new question, or simply the warmth of remembering you're not alone in this strange consciousness, then thank you truly for spending your time with us. Perhaps one moment lingers, a gesture in ochre, a fire flickering against the cave wall, or the haunting feeling that someone once stood where you now sit, looking up at the same stars. Whether it was the hush of the dreaming animal, the slow breath of the Rift Valley, or the distant song of minds in exile, these are the threads that weave us into something shared. If one of those threads stayed with you, we'd love to hear it. Even a single line, a quiet offering in the comments helps build this circle of thoughtful wanderers. If you'd like to join us again to wander through ancient forests of thought or peer into the fog of what's next, feel free to like, subscribe, or just keep your eyes open. There's more to come. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,